religious brotherhood which extended over all the Greek-speaking world. Number is great and perfect and omnipotent, and the principle and guide of divine and human life, said Philolaus, and the sentence expresses the keynote of the Pythagorean system. Number is order and limitation, and alone makes a cosmos possible. By numbers nature moves, and to understand numbers is to be the master of nature. Hence the Pythagoreans sought to understand the nature of numbers, and to trace their working in the universe, whether in the vast ordered movements in the heavens, or in the arrangements of the earth. Hence also his devotion to mathematics, a science which, as far as Europe is concerned, may almost be said to have been created by Pythagoras, so much did he add to it and systematize it. He found it but a number of scattered and unrelated facts, and left it a science. Metempsychosis or reincarnation was an essential part of the Pythagorean teaching, the purification of the soul being thus accomplished by repeated descents into matter and withdrawals into the invisible worlds, in order to transmute experience into faculty. The 3 degrees. The Pythagorean schools worked in close association with the teaching of the mysteries, but without the ceremonies. They gave a philosophical exposition of the same great facts of the inner worlds. In those schools the pupils were divided into 3 degrees which corresponded almost exactly with those of the early Christians, who called them the stages of purification, illumination, and perfection respectively, the last one including what S. Clement of Alexandria calls the scientific knowledge of God. In the Pythagorean scheme the first degree was that of the acoustikoi, or hearers, who took no part in the discussions or addresses, but kept absolute silence in the meetings for 2 years, and devoted themselves to listening and learning. At the end of that time, if otherwise satisfactory, the students were eligible for the second degree, that of the mathematikoi. The mathematics which they learnt were not, however, confined to what we now mean by that term. We study the science as an end in itself, but for them it was only a preparation for something much wider, higher, and more practical. Geometry, as we now know it, was taught in the outer world in ordinary life as a preparation, but inside these great schools the subject was carried much farther, to the study and comprehension of the 4th dimension, and the laws and properties of higher space. It can be fully understood only if we take it thus as a whole, not in mere fragments, and as an introduction to higher development. It leads a man upwards towards the understanding of all the octaves of vibrations, as to vast areas of which science knows nothing as yet, towards the intricate occult relations of numbers, colors, and sounds, the various 3-dimensional sections of the mighty cone of space, and the true shape of the universe. There is a vast amount to be gained from the study of mathematics by those who know how to take it up in the right way. It helps us to see how the worlds are made. The mathematikoi brought geometry, mathematics, and music into relation with one another, and worked out the correspondences between them, which are very remarkable. Everyone who knows anything about music is aware that there is a fixed proportion between the lengths of the strings which produce certain tones. A piano can be tuned according to a certain system of fifths, and the relation of the different tones to one another can be expressed by the number of vibrations of each tone, so a harmonious chord can be stated mathematically. This was first discovered simply by experiment. Later the mathematicians found out what the proportions should be, and again by experiment they were found to be exact. But the peculiarity is that the numbers which produce a harmonious chord have the same relation to one another as that which exists between certain parts of the Platonic solids. Our scale, so different from the old Greek scale, which consisted of 5 tones, can still be deduced from the proportions of those 5 Platonic figures, which were studied over 2,000 years ago in Greece. One might think that there cannot be much relation between mathematics and music, but we see by this that they are both parts of one great whole. The 3rd degree of the Pythagoreans was that of the physicoi, not physicists in our modern sense of the word, but students of the true inner life, who learned how to distinguish the divine life under all its disguises, and so were able to comprehend the course of its evolution. The life exacted from all these pupils was of the most exalted purity. Mackey gives the following account of the school at Crotona. The disciples of this school wore the simplest kind of clothing, and, having on their entrance surrendered all their possessions to the common fund, they submitted for 320 years to voluntary poverty, during which time they were also compelled to a rigorous silence. The scholars were divided into exoterics and esoterics. This distinction was borrowed by Pythagoras from the Egyptian priests, who practiced a similar mode of instruction. The exoteric scholars were those who attended the public assemblies, where general ethical instructions were delivered by the sage. But only the esoterics constituted the true school, and these alone Pythagoras called, says Iamblichus, his companions and friends. Before admission to the privileges of the school, the previous life and character of the candidate were rigidly scrutinized, and in the preparatory initiation secrecy was enjoined by an oath, and the severest trials of his fortitude and self-command were imposed. The brethren, about 600 in number, with their wives and children, resided in one large building. Every morning the business and duties of the day were arranged, and at night an account was rendered of the day's transactions. They arose before day to pay their devotions to the sun, and recited verses from Homer, Hesiod, or some other poet. Several hours were spent in study, after which there was an interval before dinner, which was occupied in walking and in gymnastic exercises. The meals consisted principally of bread and honey. Although we do not find any direct connection between the school of Pythagoras and the degrees of modern Masonry, yet the influence of Pythagoras upon our mysteries was profound, as Masons have always recognized. The tradition of the Pythagoreans passed into the Neoplatonic schools, and from thence much of the inner teaching came into Christian hands, and formed the basis of many of those schools of mystic instruction, which enshrined in medieval times certain of the secrets now preserved in the higher degrees of Masonry. There is a succession of ideas as well as of sacramental power, and the school of Pythagoras may certainly be said to be one of the links in the chain of Masonic philosophy, even though today the greater part of that philosophy has faded from our rites. To Pythagoras is attributed the discovery of the 47th proposition of Euclid, which now forms the jewel of the IPM in English Masonry, and is the basis not only of a great portion of exoteric geometry but, in a mystical sense, of the whole system of the mysteries, and indeed of the universe itself. It is impossible exactly to estimate the influence of any given line of tradition. We cannot say more than that some of the Pythagorean teachings, probably transmitted along several mutually interacting lines of descent, became mingled with the Masonry of the Middle Ages and formed part of the inner instruction that was associated with the ceremonies handed down among the operative builders from Jewish sources. These were preserved under binding pledges of secrecy, and emerged in speculative Masonry after the Reformation, thus forming part of our present Masonic system. Other Greek mysteries. Another line of tradition is that of the mysteries of Dionysus, or as the Romans called him, Bacchus, which approached more closely to the Egyptian scheme of initiation than the Eleusinian rites. They were celebrated throughout Greece and Asia Minor, but principally at Athens. They were carried to Rome, and afterwards formed a link in the chain of Masonic descent. Their central legend deals with the slaying of Dionysus by the Titans and his subsequent resurrection. The mysteries commenced with the consecration of an egg, symbolizing the mundane egg from which all things came. The candidate was crowned with myrtle, clothed in the sacred robes, exhorted to have courage, and then led through dark caverns amid the howling of wild beasts and other fearful noises, while flashes of lightning revealed monstrous apparitions to his sight. After 3 days and nights of this kind of experience, he was laid on a couch in a solitary cell. There was a sudden crash of waters, typifying the deluge, and the murder of Dionysus was enacted, his limbs being scattered on the waters. Then, amid lamentations, commenced the search of Rhea for the remains of Dionysus, and the apartments were filled with shrieks and groans, accompanied by the frantic dances of the Corybants. Suddenly the body was found, the scene changed to one of joy, and the aspirant was released from his confinement. After that he descended into the infernal regions, where he saw the sufferings of the wicked and the rewards of the good, and afterwards became an epopt or seer, one who could look upon the world from above, see it as a whole, and therefore understand it. Among the followers of this Bacchic form of the mysteries were the celebrated Dionysian artificers, a secret society, bound by the most rigid pledges never to reveal their SNPW, and employing emblems adopted from the building trade. These wandering bands of workmen built temples all over Syria and Asia Minor, just as the bands of Freemasons afterwards built churches in Europe. Bro Ward writes of them. They appear to have reached Asia Minor from the southeast, and, according to Strabo, could be traced through Syria and Phoenicia, via Persia and India. Apparently they reached Phoenicia about 50 years before the building of K.S.S. temple, and it is their presence which alone explains how that temple came to be built. Indeed, the Bible itself makes it abundantly clear that the temple was not built by Jews, who at that time were an agricultural race, quite incapable of undertaking the task of building such an elaborate edifice. From the same source we learn that the chief architects and men came from Phoenicia, and Phoenician letters have been found on what are believed to be the foundations of the first temple. From Phoenicia they spread first into Asia Minor, and thence into Greece, from which country Greek colonists no doubt in the course of time carried members of the guild to Magna Graecia, which was the early name for South Italy. 21. It is said that this cult of Dionysus survived up to 1908 in Thrace, in a slightly modified form at Visa, and may still exist. 22. In the same land of Phoenicia, the mysteries of Adonis or Tammuz were celebrated at Byblos or Gibel, where lived the Gybalim or stone squarers, deriving their name from that of the town. The legend of these mysteries is an interesting combination of those of Egypt and Eleusis, the death and resurrection of Adonis being interwoven with a theme upon his exile and return for 6 months of the year, which reminds us of the fate of Persephone. This cult appears in many forms, some of them savage and sanguinary, evidently derived from the dark and debased delusions of prehistoric and even cannibal tribes. Some hint of these may be seen in the account given on p000. The mysteries of Attis and Cybe in Phrygia had many points in common with the last named, the death and resurrection of Attis being the central myth. Other mystery cults existed also, all teaching similar ideas. That of the Keberoi in Samothrace, which was held in great honor in the ancient world, is thought by some scholars to be the oldest of them all, a theory which is supported by the barbarous names of the deities involved. But even these are myths of death and resurrection, the god being in this case called Kasmilos. It seems probable that when Virgil, in the 6th book of the Aeneid, depicted the descent of Aeneas into hell, he intended to give a representation of what happened in some of these mysteries. 1 Sophocles Fr 348, quoted Foucard, Les Mystères d'Eleusis, p. 362. 2 Plato Phaedo. Loeb. Edition, p. 241. 3 Cicida. Leg. 2, 14. 4 Proclus Comment. In Platt. Rempub. Quoted Foucard, Loccit, p. 364. 5 Livy XXXI, 14. 6 Man, Whence, How, and Whither, p. 316 ff. 7 Les Mystères d'Eleusis. Paul Foucard. Paris, 1914, p. 170. 8 Les Mystères d'Eleusis. Foucard, ch. 6 and 8, Passim. 9 Recherches sur les Mystères du Paganisme. Parmle Baron de Saint Croix. Ed. Paris, 1817. Tome. I, p. 347. 10 Libanius, quoted Foucard. OPCIT, p. 311. 11 Ibid, p. 149. 12 Aristophanes Frogs, 346. 13 Les Mystères d'Eleusis. Ch. 11 and 12 Passim. 14 OPCIT, Volume 3, p. 441. 15 Hippolytus Refutation of All Heresies, BKV, 3, Ante-Nicene Library ed. 16 Clem Alex. Exhortation to the Greeks. Loeb. Ed. p. 43, Lobeck. 17 Foucard OPCIT, p. 150. 18 Orpheus, G.R.S. Mead, p. 265, 266. 19 An Outline History of Freemasonry, by J.S.M. Ward, p. 24. 20 This should be 2 only. 21 An Outline History of Freemasonry, by Ward, p. 22. 22 R. M. Dawkins, Journal of Hellenic Studies, XXVI, 1906, pages 191 to 206. 6. The Mithraic Mysteries. Zarathustra and Mithraism. The mysteries of Mithra were in many ways similar to those of Greece. But they always had certain characteristics which were especially their own. And the line of succession which they transmitted was distinct from that of the 3 degrees of Blue Masonry. Some of the more important features of its ritual seem to have passed over into the 18 degrees. There was a strong military flavor about them, and they demanded from their devotees a purity of life, which was almost ascetic. Just as the mysteries of Egypt and Greece arose respectively from the incarnations of the world teacher as Thoth and Orpheus, so did the Mithraic scheme arise from his incarnation as the first Zarathustra about 29,700 BC in Persia. It taught of Mitra, captain of the hosts of the god of light and savior of mankind. Mithraism among the Romans. It is said that Mithraism was first transmitted to the Roman world during the 1st century BC by the Seleucian pirates captured by Pompey, but, as we have already seen, it was before that time in the possession of the Essene communities in Palestine. For nearly 2 centuries it attained no great importance in Rome, and it was not until the end of the 1st century AD that it began to attract serious attention. Towards the close of the 2nd century, the cult had spread rapidly through the army, the mercantile class, and the slaves, all of which classes were largely composed of Asiatics. It throve especially at the military posts, and in the track of trade, where its monuments have been discovered in greatest abundance. Some 20 of the Mithraic temples still remain, and they show certain points of resemblance to our Masonic lodges. The temple was rectangular, with a raised platform at the east end, often apsidal in form. Continuous benches ran along its walls on the longer sides for the accommodation of the BRN. And the ceiling was made to symbolize the firmament. Jerome, Epist. Kii, tells us that the system consisted of 7 degrees. Corax. The raven, so called not only because the raven was the servant of the sun in Mithraic mythology, but because the raven can only imitate speech and not originate ideas for himself. 1. Criphias. The occult, a degree in the taking of which the mystic was perhaps hidden from others in the sanctuary by a veil, the removal of which was a solemn ceremonial. Miles. The soldier, signifying the holy warfare against evil in the service of the god. Leo. The lion, symbolic of the element of fire, which played so great a part in the Persian faith. Persis. The Persian, clad in Asiatic costume, a reminiscence of the ancient origin of the religion. Heliodromus. The courier of the sun, with whom Mitra was identified, and Pater. The father, a degree bringing the mystic among those who had the general direction of the cult for the rest of their lives. It is not easy to trace exact correspondences between these 7 stages and our own degrees, because of the difference between the systems. The Corax is fairly parallel with the EA, and the Criphias and Miles with the FC, the latter being distinguished from the former by additional knowledge which may not inaptly be compared with that of the mark degree. These 3 classes together were regarded to some extent as servitors. The next stage, Leo, was the first whose members were called participants and admitted to the Mithraic sacrament. We may consider the 3 stages of Leo, Persis, and Heliodromus as divisions of the degree. The first gave access to the full fellowship of the Mithraic brotherhood, the second passed him who received it through a most impressive ceremony in the course of which he was symbolically slain and raised to life in honor of Mitra, and the third put him in possession of additional knowledge equivalent to that which is supposed to be given to us in the Holy Royal Arch, for only when he had that knowledge of the name and qualities of the deity was he fitted to go forth as a messenger of the sun, to bear his strength and life through the world. The Pater corresponded to Rim, who alone can confer the various degrees and pass on the succession to posterity. The Mithraic rites. The Mithraic cult was essentially a religion of soldiers, a veritable brotherhood of arms. Women were never admitted to their rites of initiation, although it seems probable that in earlier times there were separate degrees for them. The power flowing through the rites gave especially courage and purity, and the demands upon the candidates in both these respects were exceedingly high. There was an intensity of brotherly feeling between the initiates of Mitra which is rarely realized in our lodges today. They were pledged to fight for the right, and they stood shoulder to shoulder against all foes. The Mithraic sacrament consisted of bread and wine and salt, and was consecrated at a solemn ceremony in the mysteries, being linked to that aspect of the deity which was represented by Mitra, and intensely charged with force along the characteristic lines of purity, courage, and brotherhood, helping to bind the brethren together into a body corporate as soldiers of light and truth. This same Eucharist has been transmitted to us today through the Kuldi line of tradition, in the ceremonial of the Rose-Croix of Haredum, but the forces flowing through it have been modified to some extent, so that instead of a brotherhood of arms we have now a Brotherhood of love. The power of love takes the place of the military influence of courage, although the method of consecration in the higher worlds is the same. This is due to a blending with the Egyptian line of tradition. The analogies between Mitraism and Christianity are very close. They are well summarized thus in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. The fraternal and democratic spirit of the first communities, and their humble origin, the identification of the object of adoration with light and the sun, the legends of the shepherds with their gifts and adoration, the flood and the ark, the representation in art of the fiery chariot, the drawing of water from the rock, the use of bell and candle, holy water and the communion, the sanctification of Sunday and of the 25th of December, the insistence on moral conduct, the emphasis placed upon abstinence and self-control, the doctrine of heaven and hell, of primitive revelation, of the mediation of the Logos emanating from the divine, the atoning sacrifice, the constant warfare between good and evil and the final triumph of the former, the immortality of the soul, the last judgment, the resurrection of the flesh and the fiery destruction of the universe. These are some of the resemblances. At their root lay a common Eastern origin rather than any borrowing point to. The great powers behind evolution appear at one time to have thought seriously of making Mitraism the religion of the fifth subrace instead of the maimed Christianity which had rejected its own gnosis and put aside its mysteries. But the ideal of Mithraic purity was so high that it would probably have been impossible for men to follow it during the Dark Ages. And another very serious objection to the system was that it absolutely excluded women. Mitraism was allowed therefore to sink into the background and finally to pass out of sight of the outer world. Nevertheless, the ancient succession is still guarded and the rites are preserved in the custody of the HOATF, so Mitraism may yet have its part to play in the religious life of the future. In addition to the mysteries of Mitra, there was an Atlantean tradition of the mysteries that to which we have already referred as the Chaldean line of succession. In the days of its splendor, the Chaldean rituals put the initiate into relation with the great star angels who were adored in that mighty faith, and a relic of this tradition is still found in the hidden side of certain of the degrees of the rites of Memphis and of Mizraim. The Chaldean method of seating the principal officers of a lodge is still preserved in continental masonry, and has passed also into certain of the higher degrees. The Roman Collegia. We may now return to the main line of Masonic descent, that of the three craft degrees. We have already seen how the Jewish mysteries handed down the essentials of our Masonic rites. It remains for us to trace their transmission to our modern lodges. The next link in the chain is the Roman Collegia, in which the transition from speculative to operative masonry took place. We have seen that the science of architecture was always closely connected with the mysteries, and that our Masonic craft ritual, when properly worked, is designed to build a superphysical temple of the Ionic order of architecture, which was chosen because it is the vehicle of the special type of force which flows through craft masonry. Point 3. Other forms are built by the higher degrees, belonging to different kinds of architecture, according to the influences which are to be radiated through them, so we see that we are in the presence of a science of spiritual building, of which material architecture is but the reflection in the dense matter of the physical plane. Each order of architecture expresses an idea, and is the channel of certain types of influence associated with that idea, attracting the attention of certain kinds of angels who work along the lines of that idea in the invisible worlds. Each subrace has its own characteristic type of architecture as well as its own type of music, and these are often utilized by the great ones behind in order to impress upon the people certain characteristics which are necessary for their evolution. The principles of this inner science of building were taught in the ancient mysteries, and the temples of the different faiths were planned by the priests with full knowledge of the hidden side of what they were doing. It was for this reason that builders were always associated with temples and temple worship, and the secrets of building were carefully guarded as part of the teaching of the mysteries. Thus the confusion between speculative and operative, which was purposely effected at the breaking up of the Roman Empire, presented no difficulties to the powers behind, since those two aspects had always worked in close association, and it was merely a question of emphasizing the one, and of temporarily withdrawing the other into yet further silence and secrecy. No essential change was required. The work of King Numa. Plutarch tells us that the Roman collegia were originally founded by Numa, the second king of Rome, who lived during the 7th century. B.C.4. Numa is a half-legendary figure to our modern historians, but he was a very real personage, and the true founder of the Roman mysteries as well as of the trade guilds. Plutarch says of his character: he was endued with a soul rarely tempered by nature and disposed to virtue, which he had yet more subdued by discipline, a severe life, and the study of philosophy. He banished all luxury and softness from his own home, and, while citizens alike and strangers found in him an incorruptible judge and counselor, in private he devoted himself not to amusement or lucre, but to the worship of the immortal gods, and the rational contemplation of their divine power and nature. 5. Numa was deeply versed, so far as anyone could be in that age, in all law, divine and human. 6. Says Livy, while Dio Cassius tells us that he shaped the political and peaceable institutions of Rome, as Romulus had determined its military career. 7. In addition to all his external ability, he was far advanced on the path of holiness, and was a high initiate of the White Lodge. His especial work was laying down, at the very beginning of the Roman state, the inner foundation of Rome's future greatness. He molded both her outer religion and her inner mysteries, which in later days were to be the channel of that spiritual force which would make Rome mighty among the nations, one of the greatest empires that the world has ever known. Numa sent messengers to Egypt, to Greece, to Chaldea, to Palestine and other lands, to study all existing systems of the mysteries, so that he might adopt in Rome those most suited to the development of his people. His high occult rank opened all doors, and like Pythagoras, an even greater initiate, who came later, he was enabled to synthesize many lines of tradition into one comprehensive whole. The system which appears to have been adopted in Rome was that of the mysteries of Dionysus or Bacchus, which, as we have already seen, closely corresponded to the Egyptian system, and here we have the first of the links with the Dionysian artificers of whom Masonic tradition so persistently speaks. Numa introduced the Egyptian line of succession, and thus the hierophants of his mysteries were imams after the manner of the priests of Egypt and the Masons of today. This succession appears to have been handed down in secret among the colleges of architects until the time when Christianity began to dominate the Roman world at the beginning of the 3rd century AD. The fortunes of the colleges or guilds which were thus formed were very varied. Gradually they rose to great political power, were abolished by the Senate about 80 BC, and restored again 20 years later. The emperors issued edicts against them from time to time, but those which could prove their antiquity or religious character were permitted to remain in existence. They were finally abolished in AD 378. The colleges and the legions. Of these colleges of architects one was attached to every Roman legion, building for it fortifications in time of war and in time of peace, temples and houses. It was thus that the Roman mysteries were brought to Northern Europe. Wherever the Romans settled, the collegia worked their rites, and in process of time native soldiers were initiated into their ranks, until the system became deeply rooted in each Roman colony. Closely connected with these rites were those of Mitra which, as we have seen, were also spread by the Roman armies, although the two systems were always kept separate and distinct. The organization of the colleges, as extant records show, corresponded in many ways with that of our modern lodges. Tres faciant collegium. 3. Make a college was one of their principles, and the rule was so indispensable that it became a maxim of civil law. The college was ruled by a magister, or master, and 2 decurions, or wardens, and, among other officers were a treasurer, sub-treasurer, secretary and archivist. 8. There was also a sacerdos, or chaplain, who was in charge of the religious side of the work. The members of the college consisted of 3 grades corresponding closely to apprentices, fellows and masters, and records point to the fact that they possessed semi-religious rites which were kept rigidly secret, and also that they attached symbolic interpretations to their tools, such as the square and compasses, the plumb rule and level. They took pagan gods as their patrons in much the same way as the guilds which succeeded them adopted Christian patron saints. The 4 crowned martyrs, the patron saints of Masonry, were Christian members of a college who were tortured to death by the Emperor Diocletian for refusing to make a statue of Aesculapius. 9. They were later confused with the tradition of the 4 brothers of Horus. Bro J.S.M. Ward describes a building of the Collegia unearthed at Pompeii in 1878, which had been buried in AD 79, during the great eruption of Mount Vesuvius. It contains striking Masonic correspondences. There are 2 columns, and on the walls are interlaced triangles. Upon a pedestal in the center was found an inlaid marble slab with a skull, level and plum rule and other Masonic designs in mosaic work. A fresco in another building close by shows a figure in the act of making the FCHS.10. The Roman colleges of architects were brought to Britain by the Roman army. 1 legion under Julius Caesar established a colony at Eboracum or York. Later to be so prominent in Masonic legend and tradition, and another center was at Verulam, afterwards known as S. Albans. The introduction of the Jewish form. The introduction of the Jewish form of the Masonic ceremonies was intentionally arranged by the powers who stand behind Freemasonry about the time when Christianity was gaining ascendancy in the Roman Empire. It would have been almost impossible to continue the mysteries of Bacchus or those of Mitra in their original form, while there was so much opposition between the Christian faith and the old pagan religion. No such opposition was in Roman days felt towards the Jews, among whom the Christian faith arose and had its early nurture, and the Jewish form of the mysteries was therefore adopted by the White Lodge as the best means of transmitting the ancient rites through the Dark Ages, when the Church rigorously persecuted all who were not in agreement with her doctrines. The chief agent in the work of transition was he who was then known as S. Alban, but whom today we revere as the Master, the Comte S. Germain, the head of all true Freemasons throughout the world. I have given some account of him and his Roman incarnation in the Hidden Life in Freemasonry. 11. The transition to the operatives. The mysteries of Bacchus quite naturally and gradually gave place to the Jewish form of the same tradition as Christianity grew more and more powerful, for this was not incompatible with the Christian faith as the Greek and Egyptian traditions would have been, and the speculative secrets were more and more confused with operative terminology until the transition was complete. When the Roman Empire of the West was destroyed, political power came more and more into the hands of the Church, which grew very suspicious of secret societies, and suppressed them with great vigor. She did not, however, persecute the operative Masons, whom she regarded as a body of men wisely guarding the secrets of their trade, which she supposed to be concerned with the measurements of columns and arches, quantities for the mixing of mortar, and other such things. The masters of the White Lodge, therefore, intentionally confused the symbolical with the operative working and thus preserved blue masonry, but permitted the higher wisdom to sink for the time out of sight. Thus they provided for such of the egos born in Europe as could not develop under the cruder teaching which was miscalled Christianity. This effort to preserve the mysteries in the Dark Ages was successful, because the speculative Masons adopted as much as they could of the operative Masons' terminology, and entrusted them with some of the secrets. The latter then faithfully carried on the forms without comprehending more than half of what they meant. Then those who held philosophical ideas of which the Church would not approve allied themselves with the operative Masons, became members of the fraternity, and attended their meetings. They did not come into the guilds as operative Masons, and therefore were not bound as apprentices, but were free Masons accepted into the operative body, but not belonging to it by right of physical plain work. The tradition of the collegia passed into the lodges of the guilds, as we shall see in the next chapter, and the ancient succession of I.M.S., which we in Britain trace through S. Alban, was handed down unbroken from century to century. In consequence of this persecution, and the partial restoration of Masonry in different forms in different countries, its outward history had been obscured and confused in the greatest possible degree. It is a matter that might no doubt be elucidated by long and painstaking research, but it would be a task involving far too great an expenditure of energy and time. 1. Cf. the acousticoi of the Pythagoreans, and the fact that the Dugard of the 1 degree shows that the EA must confine himself to what is taught in the VSL. Encyclopedia British, 11th ed., Art. Mitras. See The Hidden Life in Freemasonry, p. 120. Plutarch's Life of Numa, A. H. Clough. Volume I, p. 152. Ibid, pages 130, 131. Livy, B.K. I, 18, Loeb ed. Dio's Roman History, Loeb. ed. p. 29. R. F. Gould, History of Freemasonry, Volume I, p. 42. J. S. M. Ward, Freemasonry and the Ancient Gods, pages 144, 145. J. S. M. Ward, Freemasonry and the Ancient Gods, pages 115, 116. OPCIT, pages 12 to 16. 7. Craft. Masonry. In medieval times. Evolutionary methods. The theory of human evolution, ordinarily put before us, is that of a slow upward progress of man from extremely primitive and almost animal conditions through the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, until he has arrived at his present level, which is by this hypothesis the highest which he has yet attained. This view is only partially true. It is only on the one hand, in a very broad and general sense, covering a development lasting many millions of years, and on the other in a purely local sense affecting one or two subraces, that it can be said to be true at all, for it leaves entirely out of account some of the most important factors in the case. Let no one ever doubt that evolution is a fact, that God has a plan for man, and that plan is one of eternal advancement and unfoldment, carrying him on to heights of glory and splendor of which at present we have no conception. Yet we doubt not through the ages one eternal purpose runs, and the thoughts of men are widened with the process of the sun's point. 1. But if we wish to understand anything of this wondrous scheme, we must begin by trying to grasp its general principles. First, it is no mere haphazard growth, it is being definitely directed from behind by a body of perfected men which we call the Great White Brotherhood, a body which exists to carry out the will of the logos of the solar system. It works through machinery so vast and complicated that from the physical plane we can never see more than a tiny corner of its operation, and so we constantly misconceive and underrate it. Secondly, its method of working is cyclical. The soul of man grows by occupying a succession of bodies, each of which is born, grows slowly to maturity, lives its life, learns, or fails to learn, its lesson, and then dies. Just so humanity grows by incarnating in a succession of races, each of which passes through its stage of youth, adolescence, full manhood, and decay. Often the period of decay seems sad, both with the man and with the race. Often the student of history cannot but regret the passing of a once mighty and splendid civilization to make way for a savagery possibly more virile, but certainly in its youth coarser and cruder. A flagrant example of that was the destruction of the gentle and beautiful civilization of Peru by the incredibly cruel and atrocious methods of the invading Spaniards. Another very similar case was the utterly unjustifiable attack upon the civilization of Rome by the ferocious hordes of Goths and Vandals from the north. So coarse, so brutal were they that their very names have become a proverb, and we use them today to indicate the extremes of clumsiness and wanton destruction. Yet they also were an instrument in the hand of the divine power, and their crass ignorance contained within itself the seed of certain qualities which were in danger of dying out and being forgotten among the decaying races which they were destined to leaven and partially to replace. The withdrawal of the mysteries. Even before the destruction of the Roman Empire, the withdrawal of the mysteries as public institutions had taken place, and this fact was mainly due to the excessive intolerance displayed by the Christians. Their amazing theory that none but they could be saved from the hell which they themselves had invented naturally led them to try all means, even the most cruel and diabolical persecutions, to force people of other faiths to accept their particular shibboleth. As the mysteries were the heart and stronghold of a more rational belief, they of course opposed them bitterly, quite forgetful that in the earlier days of their religion they had claimed to possess as much of the inner knowledge as any other system. The Christian mysteries. Even today it is quite commonly thought that Christianity had no mysteries, and some of its followers boast that in it nothing is hidden. That mistaken idea has been so sedulously impressed upon the world that it leads many people to feel a certain distaste for the wiser faiths which met all needs, and to think of them as unnecessarily hiding part of the truth or grudging it to the world. In the old days there was no such thought as this. It was recognized that only those who came up to a certain standard of life were fit to receive the higher instruction, and those who wished for it set to work to qualify themselves for it. Knowledge is power, and people must prove their fitness before they will be entrusted with power, for the object of the whole scheme is human evolution, and the interests of evolution would not be served by promiscuous publication of occult truth. Those who maintain the above-mentioned opinion about Christianity are unacquainted with the history of the Church. Though many of the early Christian writers are bitterly hostile to the mysteries, they indignantly deny the suggestion that in their church they have nothing worthy of that name. and claim that their mysteries are in every way as good and deep and far-reaching as those of their pagan opponents. As Clement says, he who has been purified in baptism and then initiated into the little mysteries, has acquired, that is to say, the habits of self-control and reflection, becomes ripe for the greater mysteries, for epopteia or gnosis, the scientific knowledge of God. 2. The same writer also said, it is not lawful to reveal to profane persons the mysteries of the Logos. Origen, the most brilliant and learned of all the ecclesiastical fathers, also asserts the existence of the secret teaching of the Church, and speaks plainly of the difference between the ignorant faith of the undeveloped multitude, and the higher and reasonable faith which is founded upon definite knowledge. He draws a distinction between the popular irrational faith which leads to what he calls somatic Christianity, the merely physical form of the religion, and the spiritual Christianity offered by the gnosis or wisdom. He makes it perfectly clear that by somatic Christianity he means that faith which is based on the gospel history. He says of it, what better method could be devised to assist the masses? In Dean Inge's Christian mysticism he is quoted as teaching that the Gnostic or sage no longer needs the crucified Christ. The eternal or spiritual gospel which is his possession shows clearly all things concerning the Son of God himself, both the mysteries shown by his words and the things of which his acts were the symbols. Origen regards the life, death and resurrection of Christ as only one manifestation of a universal law, which was really enacted not in this fleeting world of shadows, but in the eternal counsels of the Most High. He considers that those who are thoroughly convinced of the universal truths revealed by the Incarnation and the Atonement need trouble themselves no more about their particular manifestations in time. 3. Here we see distinct and repeated references to the hidden teaching, greater far than anything known to the Church of the present day, and carrying those who study it to a much higher level than is ever now attained by the disciples of orthodoxy. What has become of this magnificent heritage of Christianity? It is true that everything the Church knows is now given out, but that is only because she has forgotten the mysteries which she used to keep hidden. This is one of the principal reasons why she has lost control of her more intellectual sons, and has therefore failed in her duty to educate and instruct the people in the most important things of life, and has left our age the most unpractical one ever known. We have come into this world to live our lives, not to make money, and on the way in which we live depends the condition of our future births. One would think, therefore, that people would be taught all about these things in school. It is certain that everyone must die, but nobody tells us anything that is worth knowing about that important matter. On the contrary, exoteric Christianity in the days of its power positively forbade those who knew to say anything on the subject, and enforced with the most terrible weapons its incredibly foolish commandment, thou shalt not think. Happily all this wonderful wisdom is not lost, for much of it is preserved to us in the teachings of Freemasonry. There were many thousands of people at the time when Christianity began to dominate the world who still clung to the ancient tradition, who preferred to state their views in the older forms. As Christianity grew narrower and more aggressive, and less tolerant of fact, those who knew something of the truth, and wished to preserve its enshrinement in those older forms, had more and more to keep their meetings secret, for the Church was exceedingly intolerant towards anyone who dared to differ from her, even in minor matters. The repression of the mysteries. In AD 399 the Emperor Theodosius issued his celebrated edict, which was a heavy blow to the outer manifestation of the ancient pagan faith. Whatever privileges were conceded by the ancient laws to the priests, ministers, prefects, hierophants of sacred things, or by whatsoever name they may be designated, are to be abolished henceforth, and let them not think that they are protected by a granted privilege when their religious confession is known to have been condemned by the law. By AD 423 the penalties against those who clung to the old beliefs had become severe, for in a later edict of the same emperor we find, although the pagans that remain ought to be subjected to capital punishment if at any time they are detected in the abominable sacrifices of demons, let exile and confiscation of goods be their punishment. 4. Wherever possible the temples of the gods were destroyed, the ancient libraries were burnt, the statues and other relics were broken in pieces by the brutal hands of the savage Christians, and what destruction remained to be accomplished in the Western Empire was completed by the no less barbarian invaders. So perished the outer worship of the gods of Greece and Rome. The mysteries were withdrawn into inviolable secrecy, which remained unbroken until after the Reformation, when the Church had lost her power to burn and torture all who did not at least pretend to be in agreement with her doctrines. The crossing of traditions. This retirement took place in several countries simultaneously, so several traditions arose which, like the mystery systems from which they were derived, differed considerably in their details, though they were always based upon a common plan. These traditions have crossed and recrossed one another constantly throughout the centuries, have influenced each other in all sorts of secret ways, have been carried from country to country by many messengers, so that the Masonry which emerged in the 18th century bears the signature of many lines of descent, of many interacting schools of mystical philosophy. Behind all these different movements, utterly unknown except by the few disciples charged with the work of keeping alight the sacred fire during the Dark Ages, stood the White Lodge itself, encouraging all that was good in them, guiding and inspiring all who were willing to open themselves to such influence. By efflux of time the true philosophy has gradually faded out of them, again and again. And from time to time the adepts have taken advantage of some favorable opportunity to restore a little of it, sometimes by founding a new rite or school, sometimes by instigating the establishment of additional degrees in an existing rite. We see, therefore, a number of parallel and equally valid streams of tradition running down in secret throughout the Middle Ages, and emerging here and there in movements which are to some extent known in the outer world. The real continuum of Masonry may thus be compared to the roots of a plant creeping along under the ground, and giving forth apparently separate plants at intervals. There are, however, more or less broken lines of outward descent that may be traced up to a certain point on the physical plane. It is with these that we shall especially concern ourselves in the following chapters. The two lines of descent. We have already indicated that the only portion of the Masonic tradition which was anciently divided into definite degrees is that which we now call craft or symbolic Masonry, the direct descendant of the lesser and the greater mysteries of Egypt and Judea, and closely akin to the mysteries of Greece. Greater sacramental powers were conferred and deeper spiritual instruction was given to the few who were endeavoring to prepare themselves for the true mysteries of the White Lodge, but these cannot be called degrees after the manner of craft Masonry, for even in ancient Egypt they were not organized as such. Both these lines of Zion passed down through the Middle Ages. The craft degrees were deliberately confused with operative building, and were thus transmitted, although in secrecy, in the outer world, but the higher instruction still belonged only to the few, and was handed down in far deeper secrecy still, being introduced from time to time into the heart of various mystical schools, which were much more exclusive in their choice of members than the operative builders. With the craft degrees were associated the kernel of those ceremonies which we now attach to the honorable degree of Mark Master Mason, connected, as always, with the 2 degrees, and the supreme order of the Holy Royal Arch of Jerusalem, worked in conjunction with the 3 degrees, are present. Rituals for these are not therefore necessarily ancient, for all have been subjected to much modern recasting and editing. A body of legend and tradition explanatory of the ceremonial appears also to have been handed down, and the relics of this have in comparatively recent times been manufactured into separate ceremonial degrees, such, for example, as certain of the earlier stages of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, and their kindred among the side or additional degrees worked in England and America. The Cooldees. A noteworthy line of tradition, connected with craft Masonry. To some extent, but even more with the Royal Order of Scotland and the 18 degrees, is found among the Cooldees of Ireland, Scotland, and York. Few trustworthy sources of information exist concerning them, though they have been the center of many beautiful dreams, but they are thought by scholars to have been either an ancient monastic order with settlements in Ireland and Scotland 5, or in a wider sense to have represented the monks and clerics of the Celtic Church without limitation, as well as those understood to be their successors in later times. 6. We hear of them in Ireland from the 9th to the 17th centuries. From the 9th to the 14th centuries in Scotland, where they had several influential monastic communities, including one upon the holy island of Iona, which had been one of the greatest spiritual centers of Celtic Christianity long before the word Culdee is mentioned in the historical records concerning it. In Wales in the 12th century there was a strict community of Culdees living in the island of Bardsey, the holy island of Wales, while in England we find them as officiating clergy in the cathedral church of St. Peter at York during the reign of King Athelstan, who was so closely linked with English Masonic tradition. 7. It is said that after requesting the prayers of the Cooldees for victory over the Scots, when he was successful he granted them a perpetual endowment of corn, to enable them to continue their works of charity. Their name has been derived from the Celtic Sealda, meaning companion or servant of God, and from the Latin colidii, worshippers of God. Others have thought that it came from the Celtic quildike, meaning men of seclusion, but the etymology of the word is not certainly known. Godfrey Higgins claimed that the word Cooldi was the same as Chaldee, and ascribed to them an Oriental origin, although he adduces no authentic evidence for his views. 8. Celtic Christianity in Britain. Students of English church history know that Christianity was introduced into Great Britain long before the missions of S. Patrick and S. Augustine, and there has been a persistent feeling that this Christianity was not that of Rome, but had affinities rather with the Eastern rites. 9. Many traditions, none of them substantiated by authentic records, bear witness to this belief, and point the way to a truth in the background. There is the beautiful legend of Joseph of Arimathea and the Holy Thorn of Glastonbury. There is the story told by Theodoret and Fortunatus that S. Paul visited Britain, which appears to receive some confirmation from S. Clement of Rome, while Eusebius, the great ecclesiastical historian, mentions that some of the 12 apostles visited the British Isles. 10. Indeed, it was not until the 12th century that Celtic Christianity was finally brought into line with the usages of Roman Catholicism. 11. The Holy Island of Iona, once the heart of the old Celtic Church, lies off the west coast of Scotland among the Inner Hebrides. It was called High or Icolmkill, the island of Columba of the Church, and by the Highlanders, Innis nan Druidnia, the Isle of the Druids, implying that before the coming of Columba in AD 563 it had been a hallowed centre of the ancient worship of the Celts. 12. The monks of Iona spread their learning over Suidland and northern England, and the early Celtic bishops owned the abbot of Iona as their spiritual head. In 717 the monks of Iona were expelled from Scotland by the Pictish Kingdom, but their place was largely filled by the Cooldees of Ireland. 13 who appear to have been followers of the same tradition. No mention is made of the Cooldees in Scotland after AD 1382.14. We find that the early British Church, of which the Cooldees were the later survivors, possessed a beautiful and mystical form of Christianity, derived from Eastern sources and closely connected with the traditions of the Essenes, who were the immediate followers of our Lord. It had the apostolic succession of the Christian Church, but its teachings were less defined and rigid, more mystical and poetic than the Roman scholasticism, which in later days so completely absorbed it. In addition to the Christian sacraments, certain secret rites were brought to Britain by the original missionaries, rites belonging to the Mithraic line of succession, which, as we have already seen, were practiced among the Essenes, and there may also in all likelihood have existed among them a succession of Jewish masonry unconnected with the Roman collegia. The Druidic mysteries. These various lines of tradition were assimilated to some extent with the indigenous mysteries of the Druids, which, however, had lost much of the splendor of former times, and even the outer Christian rites became touched with that peculiar beauty which is the heritage of the Celt. We find confirmation of the ancient legend that the splendid Celtic race called the Tuatha De Danann, which flourished in ancient Ireland, came originally from Greece through Scandinavia, and the same is true of other offshoots of the Celtic stock which settled in Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. They all formed a branch of that fourth subrace from which the later Greeks and Romans were also descended, and the origin of the mysteries of the Druids may be traced to the great world teacher, in his incarnation as Orpheus, the singer of Hellas, though they were also influenced somewhat by the still older mysteries of Ireland which date from Atlantean times. The lyre of Apollo became the harp of Angus, and the old worship of God as the divine beauty manifesting through music thus passed down into Britain. The Druidical mysteries had a certain influence on the imported Roman or Norman rites. They are compared by Strabo and Artemidorus to the rites of Samothrace, and by Dionysius to those of Bacchus, while Nasius refers to their Cabiric correspondences. We learn from Diogenes Laertius and from Caesar that the Druidic method of instruction was by symbols, enigmas and allegories, and that they taught orally, deeming it unlawful to commit their knowledge to writing. It is said that their ceremonies of initiation required much physical purification and mental preparation. In the first degree the aspirant's symbolical death was represented, and in the third, his regeneration from the womb of the giant goddess Iridwin and the committal of the newly born to the waves in a small boat, symbolical of the ark. Their doctrines were similar to those of Pythagoras, including reincarnation and the existence of one supreme being. Apart from a few stray references in classical authors, we know of them today chiefly through the bardic songs attributed to the Welsh poet Taliesin, of the 6th century AD, who claimed druidic initiation. Cool-Ds of York blended Christian mysticism with these pre-Christian rites, and so linked them with modern Masonry. There have been many other mysteries, such as those of Ireland, closely connected with the Druids, and of Scandinavia, wherein the death and resurrection of Balder was the chief theme, and no doubt all these were connected with the source of our present Masonry, being branches of the same tree, even though external traces of their relationship in the past have disappeared. The Holy Grail. As part of this indirect heritage from the Greek mysteries came the well-known symbol of the crater, or cup, which in the intermingling with early British Christianity was identified with the sangreal, the chalice used by our Lord at the Last Supper for the founding of the Holy Eucharist. King Arthur, who has often been supposed to be an imaginary hero, was a very real and most lovable and sagacious ruler, of whom England may well be proud. His round table also is fact and not fiction, and among its knights there was a rite of the Christian mysteries centering round the beautiful story of the quest for the Holy Grail. Some there were who took the legend literally and undertook endless physical plane pilgrimages in search of an earthly cup. Others knew that the mystical meaning of the finding of the Holy Grail is the union between the higher and the lower self, which is one of the qualifications for initiation into the true mysteries of the White Lodge, for the chalice symbolically represents the causal body into which the blood of the mystery is poured. I am the cup, his love the wine. The mysteries of the Holy Grail were simultaneously celebrated in various centers, both in Great Britain and on the continent, where they doubtless became mingled with other lines of tradition, and in them we find clear traces of one of those secret schools in which the flame of the hidden wisdom burnt bright during the early Middle Ages. The tradition of the Grail and its spiritual knighthood passed into literature through the hands of Chrétien de Troyes, Wolfram von Eschenbach and other writers, whence, on the one hand, we derive the Morte d'Arthur of Sir Thomas Malory, from which Tennyson drew the materials for his Idylls of the King, and on the other the glorious music of Parsifal, in which Wagner reconstructed so magnificently the German tradition of the Grail Brotherhood. Heredum. In Scotland these secret mysteries of the East and West were handed down from generation to generation in various centres, one of the chief of these being the sacred island of Iona. Among the initiates of the Cool-D rites Iona was called Heredum. Heredum is said in Masonic tradition to be a mystical mountain, and as such it is indeed the mount of initiation beyond the veils of space and time, but it was also the secret name of the physical center of the mysteries, and this center was Iona. Another such secret center in medieval days was the Abbey of Kilwinning, and thus, the rites, which derive in part from Cool-D sources, have always styled themselves as of Kilwinning and of Heredum. The Saxon invasion of Britain drove the Celtic inhabitants of the plains to the mountains of the west and north, and thus there was a further mingling of the Jewish mysteries of the Collegia with the Cool-D rites. The Cool-Ds of York were among the guardians of the Masonic tradition in the 10th century, and the old charges tell us that an assembly of Masons was held at York during the reign of King Athelstan, when a reorganization of the craft took place. For many centuries York was a powerful center of Masonry, and we have a curious piece of testimony given in 1835, by Godfrey Higgins, who claimed to be in possession of a Masonic document, by which he could prove that no very long time ago the Cool-Ds or Chaldeans of York were Freemasons, that they constituted the Grand Lodge of England, and that they held their meetings in the crypt under the great cathedral of that city. Point 15. As we shall presently see, it was at York that certain important Masonic degrees emerged in the 18th century. The monks of the Celtic Church were largely responsible for the introduction of Christianity into Germany. Wherever they came, they raised churches and dwellings for their priests, cleared the forests, tilled the virgin soil, and instructed the heathen in the first principles of civilization. 16. Some German authorities have held that the monks directing these operations owed much of their success to the remnants of the Roman colleges of Gaul and Britain, and ultimately laid the foundations of the craft guild system in Germany. Gould rejects this view on the ground that at the time of the Celtic influence there were no craft guilds in Germany. 17. But, nevertheless, some of the secret rites and traditions of the Celtic monks passed into the German monasteries and formed one of the lines of descent of those stonemasons who built the great German cathedrals in the Middle Ages. In Scotland, the Celtic mystery tradition passed down independently of the later operative lodges, for there is no trace whatsoever of any high degrees in the extant minutes of Mother Kilwinning, number 0 upon the roll of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, which date from 1642.18. There is truth in the legend of the coming of certain of the French Knights Templars to Scotland after their proscription in 1307, and there was an intermingling of their doctrines also with the Scottish rites. One line of descent crossed from Scotland to France, where it was blended in the 18th century with the Egyptian tradition to form the rite of Haredim or of perfection under the Council of the Emperors of the East and West, as will be further explained in Chapter 11. Another line was handed down in Scotland and England, becoming blended with Jewish tradition, and emerged in the degrees of HRDMRSYCS. In what we now call the Royal Order of Scotland. The curious rhymed ritual of the Royal Order bears internal evidences of age, and, although its Christianity has been ruthlessly edited in Protestant interests, there are yet traces of the old mystical ideas of the Celtic Church. 1 Locksley Hall, by Lord Tennyson. 2 Quoted in some glimpses of occultism, ch. 2. 3 Op. Cit. p. 89. 4 Codex Theodotionus. 16, 10, 14, 23, quoted in a source book for ancient church history. Air, p. 371. 5 in British, Art. Gould's, 11th ed. 6 Hist Freemasonry, R. F. Gould, Volume I, p. 47. 7 Hist Freemasonry, R. F. Gould, Volume I, p. 50 ff. 8 Quoted by Bro. A. E. Waite, A New Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Art. Gould's. 9 Neander, General History of the Christian Religion and Church. Volume IP 117. Quoted Gould, LOC. CIT. 10 Foundation Stones. Austin Clare, p. 16. 11 in British, LOC CIT. 12 in British, Art. Iona. 13 in British, Art. Gould's. 14 Gould, LOC CIT. 15 Quoted in Waite's New Encyclopedia, Art. Gould's. 16 Gould History Freem, Volume I, p. 107. 17 Gould History Freem, Volume I, p. 109. 18 History of the Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel, No I, D. Murray Leon, pages 340, 434. 8. Operative Masonry. In the Middle Ages, the temporary custodians. In a complete study of medieval operative masonry it would be necessary to include a treatise upon the various schools of medieval architecture and the tendencies, national and economic, which influenced their creation and development. In this book we are concerned with the operative builders only insofar as they were the temporary custodians of the speculative science of the mysteries, but the study of architecture is of considerable value to the mason, for it is the physical plane reflection of mighty ideas in the inner worlds, and by the study of architecture certain of the laws of spiritual building may by analogy be reached and understood. As masons, our speculative ancestry is noble and magnificent, for we are in that respect the lineal descendants of the kings and prophets and priests of old who have been the bearers of the hidden light to men through countless generations, but of our operative forefathers who so faithfully guarded the tradition in the days of darkness we may also be proud, for their art at its zenith was unsurpassed in richness and splendor by the achievements of any other age in Europe. The great cathedrals and monasteries which they built to the glory of God and in the service of His Church are touched with the finger of divine inspiration, so that the cold marble is transfigured into almost unbelievable grace and delicacy. They are veritable dreams of beauty materialized into stone. The operative masons, too, have handed down to us many of their customs and usages, and it is well that we should understand these in addition to what we have derived from other sources. When Europe was overrun by the Germanic tribes and the empire of the West was destroyed, the Roman collegia for the most part disappeared with the other fruits of civilization. The mysteries enshrined in them survived in a more or less repressed form in Italy, France, and England, although they were kept extremely secret for fear of the barbarian invaders. It was from these survivals that the lodges of the guild masons of the Middle Ages were derived. Decline of the Collegia. Mackey shows how the Collegia declined after the fall of Rome, and how new guilds were started and old ones revived under the patronage of the Christian clergy, and asserts that after the 10th century the whole of Europe was perambulated by bands of wanderers called traveling Freemasons, who erected churches and monasteries in the Gothic style. Authorities differ seriously in opinion as to whether the fraternities who built the great cathedrals were joined together by any central organization. There is much in the similarity of style of building in the different countries, and in the Masonic signs upon the buildings, to indicate their connection. But the central organization must have allowed its branches great latitude, since the differences in style are also great. The cathedrals that the traveling Freemasons built with such great skill and artistic inspiration were laid out upon a symbolic plan, usually based upon the cross and the vesica piscis. And there is some evidence that they moralized upon their tools. Undoubtedly these were men of the loftiest intellect and spirituality. And we modern speculative Masons have no reason to be ashamed of our associations with such operative craftsmen. The Comacini. The first signs of a revival in the art of building, the first stirrings of that creative spirit which was to blossom in later years in the full glory of the Gothic, are to be found in Lombardy, where originated the style called Romanesque, which eventually spread all over Europe. According to tradition, the College of Architects from Rome removed during the last days of the empire to the safe refuge offered by the little republic of Comum, once the home of Pliny, and made its retreat upon the lovely island still known as Isola Comacina in Lake Como in northern Italy. 1 In AD 568. The surrounding country fell into the hands of the Lombards or Longobards, so called from their long beards and uncouth appearance, whose original home had been in the lower basin of the Elbe, and although at first they were detested by the Italians, with surprising rapidity they developed enthusiasm for the arts and refinement of the land they had conquered. 2. The first mention in contemporary records of the celebrated Comacina masters, who were descended from that Roman college, occurs in the Code of the Lombard king Rotheres, 643, in which they figure as master masons with power to make contracts for building works and to employ workmen and laborers. 3. They are mentioned also in the Memoratoria of King Liutprand in 713,4, when they received the privileges of freemen in the Lombard state. To their creative genius Romanesque architecture is due, and in all probability they adapted the traditional Roman methods to the requirements of their Lombard masters. It is clear from the edict that they were highly skilled architects. From a letter from Theodoric the Great to an architect whom he had appointed, we learn that the profession was highly developed, and an architect had to be able to construct a building from foundation to roof, and also decorate it with sculpture and painting, mosaic, and bronze work. This inclusiveness prevailed in all the medieval schools. Up to 1335, when the Sienese painters seceded, and subsequently other branches also separated themselves into distinct guilds. The first dawn of the new style, c. 600, was followed by a long period of obscuration, not unlike that Dark Age which in the evolution of Greek art followed the Dorian conquest. Then, with a strange suddenness, sprang forth, c. 1000, in wonderful perfection the new style, and rapidly extended itself over much of Western and Northern Christendom, the rapidity of this extension being easily explainable by the fact that master builders and workmen were often summoned to great distances from well-known centers of architecture. In the same way as Venice and Ravenna sent to Constantinople for Byzantine builders, Charles the Great and many other princes, as well as cities, procured from Italy skillful Romanesque architects, such as the Comacina masters, and the characteristics of this Lombard Romanesque are found not only in Germany and France but even in England. 5. Italian chroniclers relate that architects and builders were sent by Pope Gregory the Great to England with S. Augustine, and we learn from the Venerable Bede that S. Benedict Bishop set out for Gaul to search for masons to build the monastic church at Monkwearmouth according to the Roman style he had always loved. 6. S. Boniface visited Italy before undertaking his great mission to Germany in AD 715, Pope Gregory II gave him instructions and credentials, and sent with him a large following of monks versed in the art of building, and of lay brethren who were also architects to assist him. 7. Leader. Scott contends that these builders were Comacina masters, and bases her arguments upon the evidence of building methods and the similarity of the styles employed. In like manner she traces the Comacini into France and Normandy, southern Italy and Sicily, and even to Ireland, in fact wherever the Romanesque style of building has penetrated. The Comacina lodges. The Comacina guild not only inherited the building traditions of the collegia, but also their secret mysteries, and it was largely owing to the impulse given by them that a general revival of the existing lodges of Europe took place. A very considerable interchange of influence occurs at this time. New lodges were founded and old lodges were restored, for although the primary inspiration came from Italy, the builders in the different countries soon learned to modify the new style in accordance with national requirements and taste. Many of the higher brethren, the magistri of the guild, were men of wide culture and refinement, who knew much of the inner meaning of the rites and ceremonies handed down amongst them. And it may well be that some among them possessed the knowledge now belonging to the higher degrees, for high degree signs are occasionally found upon their work. The majority of the craftsmen, however, probably knew little more than that there was a symbolical meaning to their ceremonies and tools, and tried to order their lives accordingly. As Bro J.S.M. Ward has pointed out very clearly, the Comacini show marked analogies with our modern Masonic system. They were organized into masters and disciples under the rule of a Gastaldo or Grand Master. Their working places were called lodges. They had masters and wardens, signs, tokens, grips, passwords and oaths of secrecy and fidelity. The four crowned martyrs were their patron saints. They wore white aprons and gloves, and among the symbols associated with them we find the Lion of Judah, King Solomon's knot, the square and compasses, the level and plumb rule, and the rose and compasses. On a pulpit at Ravello, in one of their buildings of the 13th century, Jonah is seen coming out of the whale's mouth, making the FCHS.8. At Coire Cathedral in Switzerland, which is Romanesque in style and contains abundant evidence of Comacina work, several figures on the capitals of the pillars in the choir and sanctuary are depicted making Masonic S.S. Notably the FCHS, the G and RS, and several S.S now associated with the Rose-Croix, Knights, Templars, and other high degrees in Freemasonry. 9. In the town hall at Basel there is a fresco by Hans Dyg, painted in 1519, in which we may see the same S.S, and also one of the marked degree. King Solomon's knot is the traditional name among the Italians of today for the elaborate interlaced stonework executed by the Comacina masters up to the 11th century. It consists always of a single strand woven and interwoven in the most complex and beautiful designs. Leader Scott calls it that intricate and endless variety of the single unbroken line of unity, emblem of the manifold ways of the power of the one God who has neither beginning nor end. 10. Other survivals of the collegia. Before passing on to the rise of Gothic architecture, which marks the climax of operative achievement in the Middle Ages, it will be well if we indicate certain other survivals of the collegia and their mysteries, for although the great impulse to restore the art of building came through the Comacina masters, other lodges had existed in Europe from Roman days, which, under the influence of Italian inspiration, regained their power and vitality. In France especially it is clear that the organization of the collegia was never fully destroyed and that the craft guilds, corps d'état, of the Middle Ages were derived from them in unbroken continuity. The true origin of the corporation is found in the social life of the Romans, and amongst the vanquished Gauls, who always formed the principal population in the cities, and faithfully preserved under their new masters the remembrance and traces of their ancient organization. 11. Roman civil architecture, industry, art. In one word, the whole Roman tradition was perpetuated in France till the 10th century. Even the German conquerors, while preserving their own national laws, customs, and usages, accepted the Gallic industry much as they found it. 12. Not only was the trade organization preserved without break, the inner mysteries of the colleges of architects were transmitted to the medieval building guilds of France, though they were no doubt strongly influenced by the Italian masters who practiced the same mysteries and the same glorious craft. The compagnonnage. An interesting survival of the medieval craft guilds of France is seen in an association of French journeymen for mutual support and assistance during their travels. Practically nothing was known about the practices of the compagnonnage before the 19th century, although a partial revelation of one of the sections composing it, Enfant de Maître Jacques, had been extracted by the doctors of the Sorbonne in 1651, who not unnaturally stigmatized their proceedings as impiety and sacrilege. In 1841, the Livre du Compagnonnage was published by Agricole Perdiguier, a French workman of some culture, who undertook the task of revealing as much of the history and traditions of the Compagnonnage as his oath would permit, in order to put an end to the strife which ceaselessly occurred between its different sections. The Compagnonnage consisted of 3 organizations perpetually at war with one another, each of which had an interesting traditional history and claimed a traditional chief. The oldest division was that of the Sons of Solomon, originally consisting of stonemasons only, although joiners and locksmiths were admitted later. The second was that of the Sons of Maitre Jacques, who likewise admitted members of these 3 trades and later of many others, notably saddlers, shoemakers, tailors, cutlers, and hatters. While the third section followed Maitre Soubise, and was originally composed only of carpenters, although at a later date plasterers and tilers were also admitted. It is generally conceded that the Sons of Solomon were the oldest of all, and another remarkable fact is that the Masons, to be carefully distinguished from the stonemasons, were never admitted at all. Houses of call belonging to these 3 associations existed in the more important towns of France, and traveling journeymen had the right to lodging and assistance in finding work in the houses belonging to their fraternity. The 3 sections of the Compagnonnage preserved legends concerning King Solomon and his temple. Little is known of the form of the legend current among the Sons of Solomon, but there are curious indications that the story of the death of Hiram, which is not contained in the Bible, was known to them. Perdiguier tells us little, but he gives certain hints. An ancient fable has obtained currency amongst them, the Sons of Solomon, relating, according to some, to Hiram, according to others, to Adon-Hiram, wherein are represented crimes and punishments. Again he tells us that the joiners of Maitre Jacques wear white gloves, because, as they say, they did not steep their hands in the blood of Hiram. Furthermore, with regard to the use of the word chien, bestowed upon all the compagnons du devoir, he says, it is believed by some to be derived from the fact that it was a dog which discovered the place where the body of Hiram, architect of the temple, lay under the rubbish, after which all the companions who separated from the murderers of Hiram were called chiens or dogs. Some have thought, and among them Perdiguier himself, that these are indications of a legend which may have been borrowed from the Freemasons, but they clearly point to an independent line of tradition handed down among the stonemasons of France. Maitre Jacques and Maitre Soubise have also their traditional histories, likewise going back to the days of Solomon's temple, and in that of the former an elaborate account of the death of Maitre Jacques is given, which may likewise be an echo of the death of another and greater master, for it is clearly intended to be symbolical. There is also a suggestion that it was taken to refer to the death of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templars. Much yet remains to be discovered about the Compagnonnage, for no full investigation into its records has yet taken place, and it may well be that future research will show clearly that the speculative Masons of England and the operative journeymen of France derive their traditions from a common ancestry in the ancient mysteries. This at least was the opinion of R. F. Gould, the greatest of our Masonic historians. Point 13. The stonemasons of Germany. Another line of survival of the ancient tradition is found among the stonemasons of Germany. We have already traced the influence of 2 streams of tradition into Germany, one emanating from Britain through the Celtic monks, and another coming from Italy through S. Boniface. The craft guilds of Germany developed independently of monastic influence, but, according to Gould, it is probable that in the 12th century the skilled masons of the monasteries amalgamated with the craft builders in the towns, and together formed the society afterwards known throughout Germany as the Steinmetzen. Point 14. We know from the Torgau ordinances of 1462 that the stonemasons venerated the 4 crowned martyrs as their patron saints, and the Strasbourg constitutions of 1459 contain a devout invocation of the names of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, of our gracious Mother Mary, and of her blessed servants, the holy 4 crowned martyrs of everlasting memory. Point 15. From the Brother Book of 1563 we learn that they had a greeting and a grip which might not be described in writing. 16. And a curious piece of testimony came to light at the beginning of the 19th century, when a certain architect, who had joined a survival of the stonemasons and was subsequently admitted into masonry, recognized the EA grip as identical with that of the Steinmetzen of Strasbourg. 17. A ceremony of admission was in use among them, but what it was is not known. 18. At Debrunn in Mecklenburg there is a carving of the Last Supper, wherein the apostles are depicted in well-known Masonic attitudes. 19. While, according to the Bulletin of the Supreme Council of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, USA, the legend of Hiram Abiff is carved in stone at Strasbourg. 20. In the cathedral at Würzburg 2. Pillars, inscribed Jachin and Boaz, originally stood at the porchway or entrance, but they have now been moved within the building. Stieglitz in his early German architecture says that they were intended to bear a symbolic reference to the fraternity. 21. A bas-relief in a convent near Schaffhausen depicts a figure making one of the S.S of an IM. 22. In the year 1459 the stonemasons of Germany united to form a grand guild, governed by 4 head lodges, of which Strasbourg was the chief. So close are the parallels between its organization and that of modern speculative masonry that many German writers have held that the Steinmetzen were the originators of the speculative system. As a matter of fact, there appears to have been no interchange in modern times between the two corporations, and modern German craft masonry is clearly derived from England. 23. The English guilds. 3 distinct lines of tradition contribute to the masonry of the English guilds. One line was preserved among the Celts, as we have already seen, and became mingled in later times with streams from other sources. Secondly, the Roman collegia survived to some extent in England after the departure of the Romans. The Saxons found them there and did not interfere with them. 24. Thirdly, there was the influx of continental builders, beginning in the time of S. Augustine, but greatly augmented after the Norman conquest under the patronage of Archbishop Lanfranc, the first Norman Archbishop of Canterbury, a Lombard by birth and a celebrated patron of building even before he came to England. 25. All these streams of tradition were represented in the medieval guilds, and were handed down in various centers. The French craft guilds preserve accounts similar to those found in our English old charges regarding the assistance given to masons by Charles Martel. 26. The secret mysteries of the craft, common, save for certain unimportant local modifications, to all these lines of descent, Celtic, Saxon and Continental, were handed down in the lodges of the medieval masons, which were the units of organization and labor within the guilds. They were never written down, but were transmitted orally from generation to generation, the succession passing down from master to master as in the present day. The primary work of the lodges was of course operative, and the speculative ritual which was handed down so faithfully in essentials was regarded as an ancient heritage to be scrupulously transmitted to posterity. But it is unlikely that any but the few recognized its true purpose, or thought of it as containing more than a merely moral code of life. It is due to the rigid observance of the oath never to write those secrets, an oath which would have been enforced by certain pains and penalties not unknown to Masons today, that no trace of the ritual can be found in any document prior to 1717, and it is because of this lack of all records that many Masonic scholars believe that it was compiled only at the beginning of the 18th century. Even in the 14th and 15th centuries, when the old charges were written down, no mention is made of the legend of Hiram, for this formed part of the secret ritual and therefore might not be divulged. A figure representing God the Son in the porch of Peterborough Cathedral is depicted as making the FCHS. 27, showing that this S at least was known to our old operative brethren. The rise of Gothic architecture. The climax of medieval operative building was reached in the 12th and 13th centuries in the rise and development of Gothic architecture, which was inspired directly by the head of all true Freemasons throughout the world, as part of the plan for the development of the fifth or Teutonic subrace. Many theories have been advanced to account for the rapid development of the new style. Whether the wonderful change of style that in a few years spread over a great part of Western Christendom was due primarily to the discovery of the possibilities of the pointed arch or those of the so-called ogival vaulting is much disputed. Probably it was due to both, and also of course to certain movements, social and political, which were bound to favor immensely any such new enthusiasm. For a new national consciousness was rapidly gaining strength, especially in France, and cities and Communes were beginning to be in erecting vast buildings, first cathedrals and later civic edifices. The architects being now mostly laymen, the founders and donors often municipal bodies and rich citizens, and the workmen not seldom volunteers from the people. The old monastic era of Romanesque suddenly gave way to that of a new, popular, and civic architecture, and in a surprisingly short time much the same had happened as that which we noted after the passing of the fateful year AD 1000, when, according to old Raoul Glaber, Christendom cast aside its outworn attire and put on a fresh white robe of new-built churches. 28. We, however, do not need to speculate or theorize as to the causes of the rapid development of the new style, for we have the advantage of knowing that the movement was all the time being definitely steered from behind by the HOATF and a corps of able assistants under his direction. As I have already said, architecture has a powerful effect upon the consciousness of the people, for it is one of the means chosen by the White Lodge to influence the development of the various nations according to the plan of the great architect of the universe. To understand the significance of the Gothic style, we must consider for a moment an important fact of occult history, that which is technically known to students as the cyclic change of ray. The 7 rays, or types of the divine consciousness and activity, to one or other of which all living things belong, influence the world in turn, and this cyclic change produces the modifications of outlook, which are to be noted as century succeeds century. Each race and subrace has its own especial qualities to develop. The 5th root race, to which we ourselves belong, is engaged as a whole in the unfolding of intellect, but each of its subraces has likewise a quality to cultivate. The 4th or Celtic subrace was concerned with the evolution of intellect through the emotions, and so produced the beauty-loving peoples, whom we see in Greece and Ireland, while the 5th or Teutonic subrace, to which the Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians belong, is striving to awaken the intellect working in the concrete mind, and so is producing the scientific and industrial nations which lead the world today. This cyclic change of ray, which is also part of the great plan, produces other, but no less definite modifications in the corporate consciousness. In Greece we saw something of the 5th ray, the ray of knowledge, working upon the 4th subrace with its love of beauty, resulting in that intellectual type of art so characteristic of the classical age. The Middle Ages show forth the qualities of the 6th ray, the ray of devotion, working upon the 5th or Teutonic subrace, and producing as its characteristic intellectual fruit scholastic philosophy with its hair-splitting intellectuality based upon an almost fanatical devotion. Devotion, indeed, was the great characteristic of the Middle Ages. The 12th and 13th centuries, so rich in the annals of Christian mysticism, were adorned by men and women whose power of devotion reached heights rarely touched in any other age. The great S. Bernard, who, among many other noted works, gave their rule to the order of Knights Templars, Richard of S. Victor, S. Hildegard, S. Francis of Assisi and S. Antony of Padua, and a little later S. Bonaventura and S. Thomas Aquinas. All these have shone forth as a light unto many generations. Profound changes took place in the Catholic Church during these significant years, and Europe rose from the Dark Ages into the full glory of an era of culture and art. Gothic architecture was intended to lift the devotion of the masses to greater heights than had been induced by the contemplation of the flatter Romanesque style, by its soaring lines and ever-ascending curves, by the richness of its ornamentation and the splendid complexity of its design, by its amazing grace and delicacy. It had power to raise the hearts of men on the wings of its silent music to the very throne of God Himself, to mold and enrich their devotion in unseen subtle ways, to pour out upon them spiritual influences which would aid in the great work of transformation which had to be accomplished. The change from Romanesque to Gothic, then, was brought about deliberately. The inspiration was given to certain master builders in the different countries by the HOATF, and the erection of the splendid cathedrals of the period was carried out by traveling bands of masons, passing from center to center, and doubtless employing the local builders upon the actual work of construction. This, as we have said, was an age of devotion, and every stone was carved with the utmost care to the glory of God, and thereby charged with the adoration of the skillful craftsmen who work so unselfishly. The powerful spiritual influences generated by all this loving care have contributed in no small degree to the extraordinary beauty of the Gothic cathedrals, and to the power which they possess even in the present day of evoking devotion and reverence from all who approach them. The particular expressions of Gothic vary in the different countries, and even in different parts of the same country, that is always the case in every style of building. But behind the whole order of Gothic architecture there is one great idea, that of soaring, passionate devotion ever rising to the feet of God, and that is found with national modifications in England, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. This was the great age of operative masonry, and at its close the building corporations began to decline in power, until in England and Germany especially the movement miscalled the Reformation killed out ecclesiastical architecture, and church building as a fine art practically ceased. In the 14th century the merchant guilds, which organized an entire industry, became decentralized, and a new system of craft guilds gradually arose, organizing different branches of each industry. This change of organization was due to a profound change of thought among the people, which was to lead to the great stirring of the Renaissance and the growth of national consciousness in the different countries. It is at this period that the old charges of our ancient operative BRN first appear, and they were written down as the Freemasons became gradually disorganized, in order to preserve the older oral records from oblivion. The old charges. These old charges reflect in no small measure the ignorance of the time in matters of geography and chronology, but they nevertheless contain an account of the broad outline of Masonic descent from Egypt, through Judea, into Europe, and it would certainly be difficult to suppose that they were fabricated by mere operative builders who had nothing of hidden mystery to transmit. I give below a brief summary of the Dowland manuscript, which is very representative of the tradition common to all. It is reproduced from Huggins' Old Charges, 1872, and is quoted from Mackey's Encyclopedia. Point 29. The legend begins with an account of Lamech and his 4 children, who founded all the sciences of the world before the flood. These sciences were engraved on 2 pillars, one of which was later found by Hermes, who taught its contents to the people. Nimrod is next mentioned as having employed masons at the building of the Tower of Babel, and as having given them their first charge. Next Abraham and Sarah are said to have taught the 7 sciences to the Egyptians, and especially to a worthy scholar that hight Euclid. The latter was commissioned by the king to teach masonry to a large number of children of the Lord and estates of the realm. The legend passes then to David, who, when he began the temple of Jerusalem, learned the charges and manners of masons from Egypt and gave them to his people. Solomon continued the building of the temple after David's death, sent for masons from all lands, and confirmed the charges given by his father. There is no reference to the legend of the 3 degrees in any of the old charges before the 2nd edition of Anderson's Constitutions, published in 1738, except that Anan, the son of Iram, is mentioned as being the chief master of all masons, and master of all his gravings and carving and of all other manner of masonry that longed to the temple. The legend, in defiance of all chronology, then states that, 1. Curious mason that hight Mamus Grecus, who had been at the making of Solomon's temple, taught masonry to Charles Martel of France. Since the latter died in AD 741, the former would have been about 1700 years old, unless we are to understand that the charge assumes that he had reincarnated. A legendary account is given of S. Alban's work for masons in the 3rd century, and especially of his institution of general assemblies. He is also said to have obtained for them a charter, to have given them charges, and to have arranged for better pay. Later, Athelstan is said to have built many abbeys and towers, and to have loved well masons. His son Edwin, who loved them still more, held an assembly at York and gave them a charter. All the old writings were collected at this period, some in French, and some in Greek, and some in English, and some in other languages, and the intent of them all was found in all one. These old writings were digested into the York Constitutions which resulted from this assembly of AD 926. It is from this source that we draw the material now embodied in the old charges. 1. The Cathedral Builders, Leader Scott, pages 11, 140. 2. History of Art, H. B. Cotterill, Volume I, p. 232. 3. The Cathedral Builders, p. 5. 4. Ibid, p. 24. History of Art, Volume I, p. 230. 6. The Cathedral Builders, pages 143, 154. 7. Ibid, p. 133. 8 Freemasonry and the Ancient Gods, J.S.M. Ward, ch. 18, Passim. 9 An Outline History of Freemasonry, J.S.M. Ward, p. 34. The Cathedral Builders, p. 72. 11 Levasseur, Histoire de classes ouvrières en France, Volume I, p. 104, quoted Gould I, p. 182. 12 Montiel, Histoire de l'Industrie Française, preface by Silwandre, p. 76, quoted Ibid, p. 183. 13 C. Gould. Histoire Freme, Volume I, ch. 4 and v, for a complete account of what is known of the French craft guilds and the compagnonnage. 14 Concise History of Freemasonry, R. F. Gould, p. 17. Gould, Concise History, p. 19. 16 Gould, History of Freme, Volume I, p. 128. 17 Ibid, p. 146. 18 Concise History, Gould, p. 22. 19 An Outline History of Freemasonry, J.S.M. Ward, p. 35. OPCIT, 7, 200. 21 Gould, Concise History, p. 24. 22 An Outline History of Freemasonry, J.S.M. Ward, p. 11. 23 Gould, Concise History, pages 18, 24. 24 Coote cited in the Cathedral Builders, Leader Scott, p. 140. J.S.M. Ward, Freemasonry and the Ancient Gods, p. 147. 26 Gould, Concise History, p. 30. 27 J.S.M. Ward, OPCIT, p. 116. 28 Cotterill, History of Art, Volume I, p. 278. 29 Art Legend of the Craft. 9. The transition from operative to speculative. The Reformation. The dawn of a new era was heralded by the renaissance of classical learning and culture in the 15th century, a time of immense creative activity, of the bursting of bonds, of the liberation of a new and vital spirit of freedom, the direct result of which was what it is the fashion to call the Reformation. The cause of this change and reconstruction was a general reaction against the spirit of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance originated in that longing for emancipation from the shackles of the past which is probably felt by every new generation, and which now and then, favored by special conditions, succeeds in realizing its ideals. The ideals in this case were joy and liberty and personality. Liberation from medieval asceticism, medieval priestcraft, medieval dogma, liberation from the anathema that had rested on the natural rights of man, on freedom of thought and on moral judgment, liberation from traditional law and self-constituted authority, and the restoration to the individual of intellectual and moral self-rule. 1. One of the factors which helped to bring about this great revival of learning was the overthrow of the Eastern Empire by the Muhammadans. The capture of Constantinople and the conquest of Greece, driving all who possessed the means to take refuge in Italy. Many scholars came to Italy at this time, bringing with them precious manuscripts of the old Greek writers. And the restoration of classical learning, classical building, and classical art is the most notable feature of the Renaissance. The invention of printing made possible a wider diffusion of learning, and a wave of creative enthusiasm swept over Europe, leaving its mark upon the art, literature and philosophy of the age, and indeed making all things new. It was obvious to the thinking men of the period that a reform of the Church was essential, for corruption and abuses of all kinds had crept into her sanctuaries. At first an attempt was made towards a broader view of Christian doctrine from within the Roman Church, and scholars, such as Ficino, the Platonists of Italy, Erasmus, and Sir Thomas More, sought to reinterpret Christianity in the light of the philosophy of Plato and Plotinus. But this attempt failed, and, in consequence, the Reformation took place outside the Church in the 16th century. It was an attempt to purify the Church from her abuses, to bring her teachings into closer harmony with the new ideas, but it must be admitted that it did little to improve matters from the spiritual point of view, even though it won freedom of belief and liberty for the individual intellect to search for the truth in its own way. For so great was the ignorance and bigotry of the reformers that they cast aside the good with the evil, and framed a theology more intolerable than that of Rome, while to a great extent rejecting her sacramental and contemplative treasures. The reappearance of speculative masonry. After the Reformation in England, ecclesiastical architecture practically ceased as an activity of the guilds, and the operative lodges fell into decay, since their work was no longer needed. But while the Reformation thus Injured operative masonry, it made Europe safe for the re-emergence into comparative publicity of the speculative art. The guilds had always accepted rich and influential patrons, and there was nothing new in the introduction of theoretic masons into the lodges. Some have denied the possibility of any speculative masonry existing before the revival, but speculation was the rule rather than the exception in all the guilds, not only the Masonic, and in that devotional age workmen of all trades might be found moralizing upon the instruments of their labor. But between the period when operative masonry was at the height of its power and inspiration and the revival of the speculative art at the beginning of the 18th century, there was a dark period in which the light of masonry, both operative and speculative, seemed almost extinguished. Many of the operative lodges had lost nearly all trace of ritual workings, and had forgotten the traditional secrets of building no less than the ancient secrets of the building symbolism. It is to this period of darkness and decay, as well as to the not to write those secrets, that we may attribute the paucity of records referring to the mystery tradition among so many of the old operative lodges, but by the guidance of the great ones this was nevertheless definitely preserved, and transmitted from various sources into our modern craft. The first minutes. It is during this post-Reformation period, when the old lodges had almost forgotten the glory of their heritage, both operative and speculative, that we first find actual minutes of lodge meetings. These minutes show the condition into which the craft had fallen at the time. They are, as we should expect, almost silent upon all questions of ritual, secrets and symbolism, although there are occasional indications which point to the concealment of a hidden tradition. It is in this period also that the first public references to the secrets of the Freemasons occur in contemporary literature, and we are able by means of them to trace to some extent the gradual emergence of the speculative mysteries. Scottish Minutes. The oldest lodge minute extant at the present time is contained in the records of the Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel, number 1 upon the roll of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and is dated 1598. We know that it had been the custom from the earliest times for the operative lodges to accept non-operative brethren, but the first authentic record of this is contained in the same archives, which state that John Boswell of Auchinleck was admitted in the year 1600.2. The signature of Boswell, a facsimile of which is given in Murray Leone's admirable history, is followed by his mark, a cross within a circle, a symbol often used by the BRN of the Rosy Cross, and bearing a profound meaning in connection with their mysteries. One of the earliest references to the Rosy Cross in Great Britain occurs in Scotland, and in connection with Masonry, for in Henry Adamson's The Muses' Threnody, dated Perth, 1638, we find the words, "For what we do presage is riot in Gross. For we are brethren of the Rosy Cross. We have the Mason word and second sight. Things for to come we can foretell aright." The Rosicrucian Manifestos, which are the first literary memorials of the order, c. 1614, were not translated and published in English until 1652, when Thomas Vaughan, the celebrated alchemist and mystic, who wrote under the name of Eugenius Philolates and has now become an adept of the White Lodge, undertook the task. 3. So as early as 1638 Masonry was associated both with the Rosicrucian Brotherhood and with the occult power known as Second Sight. The connection of the Rosy Cross with Masonry belongs to our next chapter. The Mason word is the only secret alluded to in early lodge minutes in Scotland. What it was is still unknown, although there are curious indications emanating from two writers who did not belong to the craft. The Reverend George Hicks, afterwards Dean of Worcester, describes it about 1678 as a secret signal Masons have throughout the world to no one. Another by Robert Kirk in 1691 says that it is like a rabbinical tradition, in way of comment on Jachin and Boaz, the two pillars erected in Solomon's Temple, I Kings 7, 21, with an addition of some secret signe delivered from hand to hand, by which the know and become familiar one with another. 4. So far had the craft forgotten its traditions in Scotland that it seems clear that only one degree existed, so far as the communication of secrets was concerned. The Mason word was revealed to apprentices, under a great oath, and it is probable that a charge was read, but there is no other indication of ritual procedure. The attainment of the grade of Fellow of the Craft or Master was merely a question of age and skill, and it is ordered in the Shaw Statutes of 1598 that admission to it should take place in the Presence of apprentices, thus precluding any secrets peculiar to the degree. Point 5. As the years passed by, more and more non-operatives were admitted into the Scottish lodges, until the speculative element entirely predominated. English minutes. An indication of the secret transmission of speculative masonry is found in the Lodge of the Exception attached to the Masons' Company of London, whose records go back to 1356.6. We first hear of that lodge in 1620-21, when it was clearly a body distinct from the company, for the King's Master Mason, Nicholas Stone, though master of the company in 1633, and again in 1634, was not enrolled among the accepted Masons until 1639.7. Persons not belonging to the company were also eligible for admission, although from them a higher fee was demanded for the privilege of initiation. Elias Ashmole, the celebrated student of alchemy, who collected certain texts upon this abstruse science in his Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum, was initiated into a non-operative lodge at Warrington in Lancashire in 1646.8. In 1682, he received a summons to attend a lodge at Mason's Hall in London, which was almost certainly the exception, and was present at the initiation of 6 candidates, 2 of whom were not members of the Masons' Company. Point 9. Elias Ashmole has sometimes been cited as the real founder of speculative masonry, and also as a bro of the Rosy Cross. The latter suggestion is possible, although no evidence exists upon the point, but the former cannot of course be accepted by those who hold that masonry has descended from the ancient mysteries. A speculation is put forward by Bro. A. E. Waite in a recent book, connecting the exception with Robert Flood, the great English Rosicrucian philosopher, 1576-1637. He says, however and whenever it arose, my thesis is that the exception may have included a group of Hermetic students, of which there were many at the period, that Flood drew them together or took his place among them, and that after his manner and the manner of the Rosy Cross they began to speak of spiritual building in a hall of masons, of a hermetic art in stone, and that therefore they may have contributed something to our own unfinished sketch of figurative building. Point 10. Among the records of the exception was a book of constitutions, which Mr. Flood gave in the Harleian manuscripts, number 2054, a rough memorandum of date 1665 is found, containing the following sentence, which looks like notes of an obligation, used probably in the Chester Lodge. There is sural word and signes of a Freemason to be revealed to UWCH as you will answer before God at the great and terrible day of Iojm you keep secret, and not to reveal the same to any in the hears of any Pson W, but to the MRS and fellows of the said Society of Freemasons, so help me God. XT 11. Dr. Robert Plott in his Natural History of Staffordshire, Chap. 3, published in 1686, refers to the admission of Masons, which chiefly consists in the communication of certain secret signes, whereby they are known to one another all over the nation. He also speaks of a large parchment volume they have amongst them, containing the history and rules of the craft of masonry. 12. In the Aubrey manuscripts of the Natural History of Wiltshire, Dr. Plott refers to the adoption of Sir Christopher Wren as a Freemason. Point 13. The minutes of Lodge Antiquity No. 2, the Old Lodge which met at the Goose and Gridiron, dated 1723, refer to a set of candlesticks, which its worthy old master, Sir Christopher Wren, presented to the Lodge. Point 14. The Old Lodge at York City was in a flourishing condition in 1705, but there is no documentary evidence to show its earlier history, though a Logium Fabrici is mentioned in the fabric rolls of York Minster in 1352. From 1705, and perhaps before, the York Lodge was exclusively the home of speculative or symbolical masonry. The earliest minutes preserved are in a parchment roll dated 1712 to 1730. The greater number of meetings are described as private, while a few are referred to as general lodges. Although candidates were apparently admitted at both, new members were sworn and admitted, the only documentary trace of any ritual working. Point 15. As we shall see, the York Lodge proclaimed itself the Grand Lodge of all England in 1725, 8 years after the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England, and only a few months after the Grand Lodge of Ireland was formed. It lingered somnolently until the closing years of the 18th century, when it seems to have been silently absorbed into the bosom of its rivals. Anderson in his Constitutions of 1738 refers to Grand Lodges which derive from other sources than the Grand Lodge of England, and gives them definite recognition. But the Old Lodge at York City, and the lodges of Scotland, Ireland, France, and Italy, affecting independency, are under their own Grand Masters, though they have the same constitutions, charges, regulations, etc., for substance, with their brethren of England. 16. This is a significant statement, for lodges affecting independency, one of which is admittedly old, do not take kindly to innovations from outside their ranks. If any proof is required that Masonry was not the invention of Anderson, we have it here in his own words. Two of Steele's essays in the Taller, in 1709 and 1710, refer to the existence of signs and tokens among the Freemasons. In the minutes of the Old Lodge at York and of Mary's Chapel at Edinburgh there is evidence of the proving of BRN before they were admitted to the lodge, the latter entry referring to no less a person than Dr. Desaguliers, who in 1721 was found qualified in all points of Masonry by his Scottish BRN, an incident showing identity of secrets between the Scottish and the English lodges. 17. The same gradual transition from operative to non-operative membership took place in the English as in the Scottish lodges, and it was this infiltration of educated and cultured men which made possible the momentous events of 1717. Irish Minutes. Irish Masonry presents certain difficulties of research, for it was a point of honor among Irish Masons in the 18th century to destroy all documents, warrants, certificates, lodge registers and minute books, rather than that they should pass into the hands of outsiders. 18. Dr. Ketwada Crawley states that there was a speculative lodge of the English type at Dunnerisle in 1710-12, which used methods of initiation not to be distinguished from those perpetuated at the revival. Into this lodge Elizabeth St. Ledger, the famous Lady Mason, was initiated, and it must have worked at least 2 degrees. Dr. Crawley remarks, this last deduction will require a good deal of explaining away on the part of those brethren who hold that, because early Scottish operative lodges suffered the ritual to dwindle into the merest mode of recognition, the early English speculative lodges cannot have worked more than 1 degree. 19. This period of transition forms the connecting link between the old dispensation and the new. The day of operative masonry as practiced in the medieval lodges was over, that of speculative masonry as we know it today had not yet begun. No longer was there need of secrecy, the dread of death and torture no longer compelled the servants of the hidden light to take refuge in the workshops of the builders in stone. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of action had at last been won. And as in the twilight that precedes the dawn we may discern the faint mysterious outlines of some lovely landscape hidden beneath the robe of darkness, till, as the light of the rising sun glows stronger and yet stronger, they are clothed with richer color and beauty, so in this age of twilight we may glimpse in the outer world the dim shadows of the hidden mysteries as they emerge from their long night of secrecy and silence into the freedom of the day, and the royal art is seen once more of men. The Grand Lodge of England. The only extant record of the founding of the premier Grand Lodge of the world occurs in the second edition of Dr. Anderson's Constitutions, published in 1738. No minute of Grand Lodge itself has been traced before the year 1723.20. The following is part of the account therein given of this important event in the history of craft masonry. After the rebellion was over, AD 1716, the few lodges at London thought fit to cement under a Grand Master as the centre of union and harmony, viz., the lodges that met. 1 at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard. 2 at the Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane, near Drury Lane. 3 at the Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, Covent Garden. 4 at the Rummer and Grapes Tavern in Channel Row, Westminster. They and some old brothers met at the said Apple Tree, and having put into the chair the oldest master mason, now the master of a lodge, they constituted themselves a Grand Lodge pro tempore in due form, and forthwith revived the quarterly communication of the officers of lodges, called the Grand Lodge, resolved to hold the annual assembly and feast, and then to choose a Grand Master from among themselves, till they should have the honor of a noble brother at their head. The Grand Lodge was according formed on S. John the Baptist's day 1717, with Anthony Sayer as the first Grand Master. 21. Bro Calvert has demonstrated that the first three lodges were probably composed of operative Masons, and numbered about 15 brethren each, while the fourth lodge had a roll of 70 members and was the speculative lodge, to which all the leading men of the craft belonged in the early days, including Payne, Anderson, and Desaguliers, and a large and influential body of noblemen. 22. At first very little seems to have been done, and it does not appear that the original founders of the Grand Lodge had the least idea of starting a world movement, but with the advent of the Duke of Montagu to the Grand Master's chair in 1721, the society rose into fame and success at one bound. The first task was the compilation and digesting of the old Gothic constitutions, which as we have seen had been handed down in the lodges from operative times, and this was done by Anderson in 1721. The constitutions were printed in 1723, and a subsequent and somewhat altered edition in 1738, when the speculative system was firmly established under Grand Lodge auspices. George Payne, the second Grand Master, drafted the regulations. Anderson digested the general subject matter after a new and better manner. Dr. Desaguliers, the third Grand Master, wrote the preface and dedication, and the fourth Grand Master, the Duke of Montagu, ordered the book to be printed after its formal approval by the Grand Lodge. 23. Perhaps the most important feature of these constitutions is the definite removal of all religious barriers to membership in the order. Our ancient operative BRN had, of course, been Christians and Catholics, but now the universality of the mysteries was again to be demonstrated by the excision of all sectarian limitations. The language in which this was expressed is not happy, but it is possible that some inspiration may have been given upon this point, for it was certainly in accordance with the policy of the White Lodge. Masonry is indeed the heart of all religions, and should be bound definitely to none, although every Mason is at liberty to profess whatever faith may be most congenial to him, since they are all facets of the truth. The recomposition of the rituals. Much debate and controversy has taken place among Masonic writers with regard to the origin of our modern speculative rituals, of which there is no documentary trace before the revival in 1717. That there was a definite Masonic ceremonial in existence at this time we learn from Dr. Stukely, who tells us that his curiosity led him to be initiated into the mysteries of Masonry, suspecting it to be the remains of the mysteries of the Anti-Ents. 24. He was initiated into the order on January 6, 1721, and says, "I was the first person made a Freemason for many years. We had great difficulty to find members enough to perform the ceremony." 25. The Manningham Letters also offer testimony that the rituals of speculative Masonry belong to an earlier period than 1717. Dr. Manningham, Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, writes in 1757 of one old brother of 90, who I conversed with lately. This brother assures me he was made a Mason in his youth, and has constantly frequented lodges, till rendered incapable by his advanced age, and never heard, or knew, any other ceremonies or words, than those used in general amongst us. Such forms were delivered to him, and those he has retained. 26. This testimony is significant, for a Mason 90 years old in 1757 would have been 50 years of age in 1717, so that if he was initiated in his youth, our ceremonies must date at least from the last half of the 17th century. It will be remembered that the judgment of R. F. Gould is precise upon this matter. If we once get beyond or behind the year 1717, i.e., into the domain of ancient Masonry, and again look back, the vista is perfectly illimitable, without a speck or shadow to break the continuity of view which is presented to us. 27. The decay of the operative lodges, noted earlier in this chapter, had a disastrous effect upon the ancient ritual which had been handed down orally from lodge to lodge and from master to master from the days of the Roman collegia. No word of it might ever be written, and it had to be learnt by heart by the masters and officers of the lodges. By the time, however, that we reach the days of the revival, this oral tradition had become much corrupted, and although the ancient ritual actions were still remembered, the words accompanying them had degenerated into mere verbal jargon, often quite unintelligible to those who recited it. One example will be sufficient to indicate the state of affairs. Several inns in England are named the Goat and Compasses, and as it stands the phrase has no meaning, unless it be taken to refer to the perennial fable of the riding of the goat. The real derivation is from the words God encompasses us, degenerated into goat encompasses. It was into a somewhat analogous state that the whole ritual had fallen in the days of Anderson and Desaguliers, who after the founding of the new Grand Lodge set to work to bring order out of chaos. They proceeded to collect and revise all the workings known to them, clothing the skeleton of the ritual in the 18th century English so familiar in our ears today. On the whole their task was well carried out, and although many losses had occurred before 1717, the portion which Anderson brought with him was fairly representative of the general chaos. Anderson was clearly not a man of genius, though he did his best, and it may well be a matter of regret that the stilted language of that dullest of dull periods should have been chosen to clothe the ancient mysteries, rather than the inspired and stately English of a century before. But taverns are not conducive to spiritual inspiration, and it was in taverns that this rebirth of the mysteries took place. 2 and 3 degrees. At first it would appear that only 2 degrees were worked, for the constitutions of 1723, Regulation 13, speak of apprentices, and of masters and fellow craft who could only be made in Grand Lodge, unless by a dispensation. 28. This rule was repealed in 1725, when Grand Lodge enacted that the master of each lodge, with the consent of his wardens and the majority of the brethren, being masters, may make masters at their discretion. 29. There is in this same year a mention of 3 degrees in the working of the Grand Lodge of all England at York, when a speech was delivered by Dr. Francis Drake, Junior Grand Warden, in which he mentions Epsilon Alpha, FC, and MMRF. Gould holds that the apprentice part consisted of what we now know as the 1 degree and 2 degrees, and that the master's part was our 3 degrees, containing the legend of Hiram. 30. He considers it settled beyond dispute, not only that what we now call the 3rd degree existed before the era of Grand Lodges, but that, having passed through a long decline, its symbols had become corrupted, and their meaning, to a great extent, forgotten, when the step itself then known as the master's part is first heard of, i.e., unequivocally referred to, in any print or manuscript to which a date can be assigned, 1723, 31. It seems probable that the original workings may have been compressed into 2 degrees, and the subsequent division into 3 degrees may well have been a rearrangement of the material in accordance with ancient tradition. Evidence for the working of 3 grades of masonry occurs as early as 1725 in London in the Transactions of the Philomusicii et Architecturae Societas, in which certain brethren are recorded as regularly past masters, regularly past fellow crafts, and regularly past fellow craft and master, although it is not clearly known exactly what took place. 32. By 1738 the procedure in the lodges seems to have been generally similar to that known among us today. Opposition. That there was at first some distrust and dislike of the new movement upon the part of older Masons, is certain. In the second edition of the Constitutions, 1738, Anderson tells us that in 1720, at some private lodges, several very valuable manuscripts, for they had nothing yet in print, concerning the fraternity, their lodges, regulations, charges, secrets, and usages, particularly one writ by Mr. Nicholas Stone, the warden of Inigo Jones, were too hastily burnt by some scrupulous brothers, that these papers might not fall into strange hands. 33. We know that there were other lodges not at first included in the Grand Lodge, and it may well be that certain of the older BRN viewed the new venture with suspicion, and destroyed their records to prevent them from falling into the hands of innovators. There is a suggestion, too, that other traditions were preserved elsewhere in greater fullness, as we shall see in connection with the schism of the Anti-Ents. But although the Grand Lodge was inaugurated humbly enough, it soon began to attract attention under the Duke of Montagu, and its success as a movement was immediately established. The succession of I.M.S. The succession of I.M.S. was preserved under the new dispensation, although there is little trace in London of a definite degree in the sense of ritual working. Such a degree was part of the authorized working of the ancients in 1751, though it was not adopted by the moderns until 1810.34. The actual power, however, was transmitted by the act of installation, which forms the essential part of the sacrament, and we learn From the manner of constituting a new lodge according to the ancient usages of Masons given in the constitutions of 1723, that after the new master had submitted to the charges of a master as masters have done in all ages, the Grand Master shall by certain significant ceremonies and ancient usages, install him. 35. The Grand Lodges of York, Ireland, and Scotland. But although the impulse towards revival clearly originated in London, with the erection of the Grand Lodge of England, the Apple Tree Tavern was not the only temple of the mysteries. Other lodges existed both in England and the sister kingdoms, and other equally valid streams of tradition began to emerge in different centers. York was for unnumbered years a powerful and hallowed sanctuary of speculative masonry, and the Old Lodge at York proclaimed itself a Grand Lodge in 1725. It is even possible that it may have called itself such before, for there is written testimony in 1778 from the then York Grand Secretary to the effect that the Grand Lodge at York antedated the Lodge of London by 12 or more years. 36. It is clear that ancient York workings existed, and that something of their tradition, passing through Irish and ancient masonry, is with us today, blended with the traditions inherited from Anderson. York has a glamour about its ancient walls like that which surrounds Kilwinning and the sanctuary which was Haredum. To York also we must look for one of the guardian centers of our mysteries. It is clear from a study of Irish masonry and that of the ancients, which was so closely allied to it, that more was handed down from the past than the 3 blue degrees, for the latter on their own showing are not complete without the symbolism preserved for us in the Holy Royal Arch, and other similar degrees, which did not, it would seem, emerge in the south. The first mention of the Holy Royal Arch comes from Youghal in Ireland in 1743, the second emanates from York in 1744. The ancients, though they had nothing to do with the Grand Lodge of all England at York, nevertheless persistently refer to themselves as York Masons, thus claiming kinship with the York tradition. On the other hand, Murray Leone shows that the records reveal no traces of ritual procedure or of speculative masonry as we know it today until after the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, and that the speculative ritual was derived from England after that event. No evidence exists to show that Lodge Kilwinning, the second lodge in Scotland, according to the Shaw Statutes, whose extant minutes go back to 1642, ever worked any degrees other than those belonging to craft masonry, either before or after the formation of the Grand Lodge. A past master of Lodge Canongate Kilwinning draws my attention to a serious mistake which I made in the Hidden Life in Freemasonry, p. 119. In describing that historic lodge as founded in 1723, he says, Lodge Canongate Kilwinning No. 2 received a charter from the Mother Lodge at Kilwinning in Ayrshire, now known as Lodge Mother Kilwinning No. 0, dated December 20, 1677, and recorded in the minutes of Kilwinning Lodge on that date. The lodge history tells us that at the beginning of the 18th century the lodge numbered amongst its members the foremost noblemen and gentlemen of Scotland who were devoted to the Stuart cause. The unsuccessful rising in 1715 sent those who had escaped death on the battlefield into exile, and during the confusion attendant on those times, the whole early records of the lodge were lost or destroyed, and no trace of them can now be found. At length the survivors, a small but trusty band, met about the beginning of 1735 and resumed the meetings. The earliest minute in preservation is dated February 13, 1735, and begins, Canongate, Feb. 13th AD 1735 AM 5735. The lodge having met according to adjournment due appoint. The lodge is never closed, but adjourned to the next fixed day of meeting. Most lodges install on S. John the Evangelist's Day, December 27th. Lodge Canongate Kilwinning installs on S. John the Baptist's Day, 24th June. The earliest reference in the minutes of this, or any Scottish, lodge, to the admission of Master Masons is on March 31, 1735. I apologize for the error in my previous book, and will see that it is corrected if a second edition should be needed. The Grand Lodge of Ireland appears to have come into being in 1725. And the Irish rituals are clearly derived from a somewhat different line of tradition from those preserved in southern England, being indeed closely allied with the York workings. The Grand Lodge of Scotland was formed in 1736, and here again we find marked differences of ritual and even of secrets, though there is no evidence on the physical plane to show whence this distinctive Scottish masonry is derived. It is from these three premier Grand Lodges, and from the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, now amalgamated with the Grand Lodge of England, that all Anglo-Saxon masonry, and probably much of continental masonry also, has sprung. The details of their workings may differ in non-essentials, but the same hallowed mysteries were the heritage of all, and through them have penetrated into all the world to be a light to those who sit in darkness and to guide their feet into the way of peace. The ancients. As a further indication that the Grand Lodge of England had not inherited the only tradition current in the United Kingdom, we find the schismatic Grand Lodge of the Ancients formed in 1751 in London, under the title of the Grand Lodge of England according to the old institutions. The researches of Mr. Henry Sadler into the archives of the Grand Lodge prove that the establishment of this body was due to the activity of a number of Irish Masons resident in London. 37. They claimed affinity with the York tradition, though not with the York Grand Lodge, and it is clear that they differed considerably from the modern or regular Grand Lodge of England. Their Grand Secretary, Lawrence Dermot, says, "The ancients under the name of Free and Accepted Masons according to the old institutions, and the moderns under the name of Freemasons of England, though similar in name, yet differ exceedingly in makings, ceremonials, knowledge, Masonic language and installation, so much that they have always been, and still continue to be, two distinctive societies totally independent of each other." 38. Furthermore, he tells us something of the nature of such differences. A modern Mason may safely communicate all his secrets to an ancient Mason, but an ancient cannot with like safety communicate all his secrets to a modern Mason without further ceremony. For as a science comprehends an art, though an art cannot comprehend a science, even so ancient Masonry contains everything valuable among the moderns, as well as many other things that cannot be revealed without additional ceremonies. 39. There is little doubt that these differences consisted of changes in the 3 degrees. The degree of IM, and the Holy Royal Arch, and they are clearly the result of the inheritance of a different stream of Masonic tradition. It is almost certain that the moderns did make innovations in the ritual. They seem to have exchanged the words of the 1st and 2nd degrees, because of the exposures contained in Samuel Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, which had an enormous sale in England and on the continent, and the old order is still preserved in continental Masonry, especially in lodges working what is known as the French Rite. The Holy Royal Arch. The first mention in contemporary records of the Holy Royal Arch occurs at Ewell in Ireland in 1743, and we hear of it again in 1744 in Dr. Designy's serious and impartial inquiry into the cause of the present decay of Freemasonry in the Kingdom of Ireland, in which he tells us of the existence of an assembly of Royal Archmasons at York, from which city the degree was introduced into Dublin, that it was known and practiced in London some small space before, and that the members thereof were an organized body of men who have passed the chair. 40. We have already seen how in ancient days the Royal Arch was associated with the 3 degrees, as the mark was with the 2 degrees, and both these items of ceremonial appear to have been included in that corpus of tradition which reached Anderson in 1717 or thereabouts, and to have been worked in private in certain of the lodges from time immemorial, although they do not seem to have been formally sanctioned by the Grand Lodge. The first exoteric mention of the marked degree occurs in the Minute Book of a Royal Arch chapter in Portsmouth in 1769.41. A careful study of existing rituals of both these degrees shows that considerable differences occur in English, Scottish and Irish workings, and it is clear that in their case also many lines of tradition were handed down. Bro A. E. Waite refers to a ritual of the old York Mark Lodge in his possession, which differs almost completely from any of our present workings. 42. It is not difficult to account for differences of ritual between ancients and moderns, when we consider the number and variety of traditions handed down throughout the ages. The United Grand Lodge. In 1813 the 2 rival Grand Lodges of England formally united, and thenceforward the United Grand Lodge of England has been the governing body of craft masonry in that country. At the union an amalgamation took place between the 2 lines of tradition, and English craft masonry is indebted to Ireland and to York, as well as to the Apple Tree Tavern for its methods of working. According to the Articles of Union already noted, it was agreed upon that for the future, pure antient masonry consists of 3 degrees, and no more, viz., those of the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and the master mason, including the Supreme Order of the Holy Royal Arch. But this article is not intended to prevent any lodge or chapter from holding a meeting in any of the degrees of the orders of chivalry, according to the constitutions of the said orders. Point 43. In such wise the Masonic tradition became fixed, and it remains the same in essentials today. Craft masonry in other countries. It is commonly held that masonry was introduced into France from England about 1732, though some think that it came in 7 years earlier, under Jacobite auspices. In reality it antedates that era altogether, for Masonic tradition of some sort had existed in France from time immemorial, and when King James II took refuge at Clermont Abbey in 1688 he found a Masonic center there which he tried unsuccessfully to use for political purposes. Whether the English rite which was brought in at the date above mentioned linked itself in any way with the indigenous masonry is uncertain. There is no evidence upon the point, but French masonry has diverged very considerably from the English workings. The symbolic or blue degrees of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite appear in many ways to preserve a fuller tradition, and they probably represent another line of descent, for they employ the ancient Chaldean method of seating the three principal officers in an isosceles triangle. As in the regular Grand Lodge of England prior to 1810, there is no degree of I.M. worked on the continent, except in bodies deriving authority from the Grand Lodge in London. The elected master is placed in the chair without ceremony, as in the older English working. The Grand Lodge of Scotland recognized the ceremonial degree only in 1872. It was derived from sources accessible to the ancients, possibly from York. Certain of the signs of the degree are found on the walls of Egyptian temples, and when its inner or occult side is studied, installation into the ch of ks. Is found to have formed part of the genuine and immemorial tradition of the mysteries. Masonry is said to have appeared in Germany in 1733, though the first known lodge was established in Hamburg in 1737, in Sweden it dates from 1735, while Dutch masonry was inaugurated in 1731, when the Duke of Lorraine was initiated at The Hague by Dr. Desaguliers. Point 44. It was introduced into America before 1733, when the first lodge holding written authority from the Grand Lodge of England was established in Boston. Point 45. It was in reality practiced in America before the date of the founding of Grand Lodge, being carried thither by some of the earlier settlers. Many lodges were constituted with Scottish, Irish and ancient warrants, which accounts for the many variations to be found in American workings. In America today there are over 50 Grand Lodges with a membership of at least 2 millions, many of whom also belong to various high degree obediences. Point 46. There are 9 Grand Lodges in Canada, with 120,000 members, and 7 Grand Lodges in Australasia, with 75,000 members. Point 47. Craft masonry flourishes likewise in many other countries, and is unquestionably one of the greatest powers for good in the world in this 20th century. Cotterill. History of Art, Volume I, p. 390. History of the Lodge of Edinburgh, D. Murray Leon, p. 53. The Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. A. E. Waite, p. 375. Gould. Concise History, p. 183. History of the Lodge of Edinburgh. D. Murray Leon, p. 10. Gould. Concise History, p. 105. Gould. Concise History, p. 111. Ibid, p. 112. Ibid, p. 116. Emblematic Freemasonry, p. 43. Ibid, p. 115. Emblematic Freemasonry, p. 119. Ibid, p. 120. The Builders, Volume X, No. 2, p. 55. Gould. Concise History, p. 122. Gould. Concise History, p. 197. History of the Lodge of Edinburgh. D. Murray Leon, p. 159. Dr. Ketwada Crawley. AQC, 16, 69. AQC, 8, 55. Gould. Concise History, p. 204. Gould. Concise History, p. 201. A. F. Calvert. The Grand Lodge of England, cited in the Builders, Volume X, p. 84. Ibid, p. 205. Gould. Concise History, p. 54. Gould. Concise History, p. 223. Ibid, p. 249. R. F. Gould. AQC 16, 30. The Constitutions of Freemasons, Bicentenary ed., p. 61. AQC 16, p. 38. AQC 16, p. 36. Gould. Concise History, p. 223. Ibid, p. 228. AQC 16, p. 33. See ante, page 246. Gould. Concise History, p. 225. The Constitutions of Freemasons, Bicentenary ed. p. 72. A. E. Waite. Emblematic Freemasonry, p. 59. Gould. Concise History, p. 252. Quoted. LOCCIT. Ibid, p. 256. Quoted. LOCCIT, p. 199. Quoted. LOCCIT, p. 263. Emblematic Freemasonry, p. 62, note. AQC, 16, 63. Gould, Concise History, p. 306. Ibid, p. 333. Ibid, p. 345. Ibid, pages 348, 349. 10. Other lines of Masonic tradition. The stream of secret societies. In the name of the Christ, the Lord of love and compassion, that body, which called itself his church and professed to follow him, had established a reign of terror throughout Europe, and plunged into a mad orgy of cruelty and unbridled wickedness such as the world has rarely seen even among the most degraded savages. It was this desperate condition of affairs that made necessary the intentional confusion of the inner truths of Freemasonry with the trade secrets of the operative guilds, but that was not the only method adopted by the powers behind to carry on the tradition of the light through those days of more than Cimmerian darkness. There were also certain societies, secret or semi-secret, which existed for the express purpose of perpetuating a noble and pure teaching. Just because they had to work so warily and so quietly, it is not easy to find traces of the activity of these organizations, but a very earnest Mason, Mrs. Isabel Cooper Oakley, has devoted years of patient and laborious original research in many parts of Europe to the study of this subject, and has published the results of her toil in Traces of a Hidden Tradition in Masonry and Medieval Mysticism. From that book, I extract the following list of mystical societies, interspersed with a few names of individual mystics. In the 3rd century we find Manes, the widow's son, the link for all of those who believe in the great work done by the sons of the widow and the Magian Brotherhood. In the 4th century the central figure for all occult students is the great Iamblichus, the forerunner of the Rosicrucians. From the 3rd to the 9th century the following organizations and sects appear: Manichaeans, Euchites, Dionysian artificers, Ophites, Nestorians, Eutychians, and the Magi Stricomacini, of whom we may read in Llorente's History of the Inquisition, and in Professor Herzerio's I Maestri Comacini. This author says, in this darkness which extended over all Italy, only one small lamp remained alight, making a bright spark in the vast Italian necropolis. It was from the Magi Stricomacini. Their names are unknown, their individual works unspecialized, but the breath of their spirit may be felt all through those centuries, and their name collectively is legion. We may safely say that of all the works of art between 800 and 1000 AD, the greater and better part are due to that brotherhood, always faithful and often secret, of the Magi Stricomacini. In the 10th century we find still the Manichaeans and the Euchites, also the Polychians and the Bogomiles. 11th century, the Catari and Potarini. Condemned by the Roman Church, both derived from the Manichaeans, the Polychians with the same tradition, also persecuted, the Knights of Rhodes and of Malta, scholastic mystics. 12th century, the Albigenses appear, probably derived from Manichaeans who settled in Albi, the Knights Templars, publicly known, the Catari, widely spread in Italy, the Hermetists. 13th century, the Brotherhood of the Winkellers, the Apostolikers, the Beghards and the Beguinen, the brothers and sisters of the Free Spirit, the Lollards, the Albigenses, crushed out by the Catholic Church, the Troubadours. 14th century, the Hesychists, the precursors of the Quietists, the Friends of God, German. Mysticism, led by Nicholas of Basle, Johann Tauler, Christian Rosenkreutz, the Great Templar. Persecution, the Fraticelli. 15th century, the Fratraluces at Florence, also the Platonic Academy, the Alchemical Society. Society of the Trowel, the Templars, the Bohemian Brothers, or Unitas Fratrum, the Rosicrucians. 16th century, the Rosicrucians became widely known, the Order of Christ, derived from the Templars, Cornelius Agrippa of Netzheim, in connection with a secret association, Saint Teresa, S. John of the Cross, Philippe Paracelsus, the Fire Philosophers, Militia Crucifero Evangelica, under Simon Studian, the Mysteries of the Hermetic Masters. 17th century, the Rosicrucians, the Templars, the Asiatische Academia di Secreti, at the home of John Baptista Porta, the Quietists, founded by Michael de Molinos, and the whole group of Spanish mystics. 18th century, the Fratraluces, or the Knights of Light, the Rosicrucians, the Knights and Brothers Initiate of St. John the Evangelist from Asia, or the Asiatische the Martinists, the Theosophical Society, founded in London, 1767, by Benedict Chas-Tamer, a mystic Mason, the Quietists, the Knights Templars, some Masonic bodies. The various sects and bodies here detailed should not be understood as belonging exclusively to the century under which they appear in the above classification. All that this list is intended to convey is that such sects were more markedly prominent during the century in which they are placed. 1. Yet again Mrs. Cooper Oakley writes with deep appreciation of the work done by the troubadours. From the death of Manes, AD 276, there was an intimate alliance, even a fusion with some of the leading Gnostic sects, and thence do we derive the intermingling of the two richest streams of Oriental wisdom, the one, directly through Persia from India, the other, traversing that marvelous Egyptian period, enriched by the wisdom of the great Hermetic teachers, flowed into Syria and Arabia, and thence with added force garnered from the new divine powers made manifest in the profound mystery of the blessed Jesus into Europe, through northern Africa, finding a home in Spain, where it took deep root. From this stock sprang into full flower that richness of speech and song for which the troubadours will live forever, Manichaeans who sang and chanted the esoteric wisdom they dared not speak. Next we see them dispersed in sects, taking local names separated in name only, but using the same secret language, having the same signs. Thus, everywhere they journeyed, and no matter by what name they were called, each knew the other as a widow's son, bound together on a mystic quest. Knitted by virtue of a secret science into one community, with them came from the East a chivalric ideal, and they chanted of love and sang of heaven, but the love was a divine love, and their heaven was the wisdom and peace of those who sought the higher life. 2. I have taken 2 long extracts from Mrs. Oakley's book, because it is the only one of which I know which treats in any detail of these little-known sects. Among them 2 stand out as better known, or at any rate more fully discussed than the others, and both of them have to a considerable extent influenced our modern Masonic rituals, especially those of the higher degrees. These 2 are the Knights Templars and the Brethren of the Rosy Cross. The Knights Templars. The Order of the Knights Templars, called also the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, was founded in 1118 by Hugues de Payens, Hugo de Paganis, a knight of Burgundy, and Godefroy de St. Omer, a knight of northern France, in order to protect the pilgrims who flocked to the Holy Land after the First Crusade. Baldwin I, king of Jerusalem, allotted to those 2 knights and 6 others who joined with them quarters near the site of Solomon's temple, whence their name Templars was derived. 9 years later Hugues de Payens visited Europe with the object of placing the new order upon a more secure foundation and of gaining recognition and a rule from the Pope. He secured the enthusiastic support of Esbernard, the great abbot of Clairvaux, and in 1128 a rule, which was drawn up for them by Esbernard himself, was approved for the Knights Templars by the Council of Troyes. It was not, however, until 1163 that Pope Alexander III issued the charter of the order, and its organization was fully established. The order of the Temple in the days of its glory consisted of various grades. The Knights, Fratrum formed its most important section, at least from the military point of view. At their reception they were pledged to observe the 3 evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. 3. Like the members of all other religious orders throughout the Church, the Knights, who were often of high birth, were each entitled to 3 horses, a squire and 2 tents. Married men were also received, but only on condition of bequeathing 1/2 of their property to the order. No women were admitted. Besides these there was also a body of clergy, fratra capellani, bishops, priests, and deacons who were under the same vows as the knights, and by special dispensation owed obedience to no superior, ecclesiastical or civil, except the Grand Master of the Temple and the Pope. It was laid down that the confessions of brethren of the order should only be heard by these special clergy, and thus their secrets were guarded inviolate. There were also 2 classes of serving brothers, those bearing arms, fratra serviens armigeri, and the menials and craftsmen, fratra serviens famulae and officii. At the head of the whole organization stood the Grand Master. Next in rank came the seneschal of the temple, and the marshal, the supreme authority in military affairs, and the order was administered in provinces under a number of commanders. After the fall of the Latin kingdom, the headquarters of the order were moved from Jerusalem to Cyprus, and Paris became the chief Templar center in Europe. The influence wielded by the Templars grew rapidly. They fought gallantly in the various crusades, and also became the great international financiers and bankers of the age, thereby amassing vast riches. It is reckoned that before the middle of the 13th century they possessed 9,000 manors in Europe alone. The Paris Temple was the center of the world's money market, and their influence and wealth in England also were very great. In the later part of that century they are said to have drawn a revenue amounting to nearly 2,500,000 in our money, more than that of any European kingdom or state of that time. 4. At this period the Templars were believed to number between 15,000 and 20,000 knights and clergy. But in attendance upon these there was a veritable army of squires, servants, and vassals. Their influence may be estimated from the fact that members of the order were summoned to the great councils of the Church, such as the Lateran Council of 1215 and the Council of Lyons of 1274.5. The Knights Templars brought back to the West a set of symbols and ceremonies belonging to the Masonic tradition, and they possess certain knowledge which is now given only in the degrees of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. The order was thus one of the repositories of the hidden wisdom in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, although the full secrets were given only to the few alone. Therefore, among the religious orders, their ceremonies of reception were conducted in strict privacy. As was but natural in such an age, the most evil and horrible practices were attributed to the order because of the secrecy, and stories were told which had absolutely no foundation whatever in fact. In the Templar form of what we now call the 18 degrees, the most wise sovereign was an ordained priest or bishop, and the bread and wine which was consecrated in open chapter in the course of a splendid ceremony was a veritable Eucharist, a wonderful blending of the Egyptian with the Christian sacrament. The suppression of the Templars. The suppression of this great and powerful order forms one of the darkest blots upon the tenebrous history of the Roman Catholic Church. The reports of the French trial were published by Michelet, the great historian, in 1851-61, and an excellent digest of the evidence given both in France and England is contained in a series of articles which appeared in 1907 in Ars Quatuor Coronatorum. XX, 47, 112, 269. We can give here but a brief outline of what took place, referring those who wish for a more detailed account to the sources quoted, and to the general literature of the subject. Philip the Fair, King of France, was in desperate need of money. He had already debased the coinage, had arrested the Lombard bankers and the Jews, and after confiscating their wealth upon a trumped-up charge of usury, a thing abhorrent to the medieval mind, had expelled them from his country. Then he determined to get rid of the Templars, who had lent him large sums, and since the Pope, Clement V, owed his position to the intrigues of Philip, the matter presented little difficulty. His task was rendered easier, too, by the accusations brought against the order by the ex-knight Esquio de Fleuren, who had a personal interest in the matter, and pretended to reveal all manner of evil things, blasphemy, immorality, idolatry, and the worship of the devil under the form of a black cat. This traitor is still execrated in some of the Masonic rituals, together with one Noffo Dei of Florence, who, however, had nothing to do with the matter. These charges were accepted by Philip with delight, and on Friday, October 13, 1307, all the Templars throughout France were arrested. Without warning on behalf of the most infamous tribunal that has ever existed, a collection of demons in human form called in ghastly mockery the Holy Office of the Inquisition, which at this time held plenary jurisdiction in this and other countries of Europe. The Templars were horribly tortured, so that many died, and the remainder confessed in set terms whatever the Church required. The interrogations were concerned chiefly with the alleged denial of Christ and the spitting on the cross, and in a minor degree with certain grave charges of immorality. A study of the evidence reveals the entire innocence of the Templars and the diabolical ingenuity of the familiars of the Holy Office, who kept them separated without adequate defense or proper consultation, and circulated among them lying rumors that the Grand Master had confessed to the Pope that there were evils in the order. The brethren were cajoled, bribed, and tortured into confessing crimes they had never committed, and they were treated with the most fiendish cruelty. Such was the justice of those who bore the name of the Lord of Love. In the Middle Ages, such the compassion which was shown to his faithful servants, whose only crime was their wealth, lawfully won for the order, and not for themselves. Philip the Fair obtained his money, but what karma, even in 1,000 lives of suffering, could ever be sufficient for so vile a wretch? The Roman Church has doubtless many good deeds to its credit. But can all of them put together ever cancel such incredible wickedness as this? The Pope desired to destroy the order, and called a council at Vienne in 1311 for that purpose, but the bishops refused to condemn it unheard. The Pope, therefore, abolished the order in private consistory on November 22, 1312, 5312 AL, a date still commemorated in a striking fashion in our high-grade rituals, although he admitted that the charges were not proved. The riches of the temple were to be transferred to the order of S. John, but it is certain that the French portion found its way into the coffers of King Philip. The last and most brutal act of this stupendous tragedy occurred on the 14th of March, 1314, when the venerable Grand Master of the Temple, Jacques de Molay, and Goffred de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, were publicly burned as relapsed heretics before the great cathedral of Notre Dame. As the flames closed round him, the Grand Master summoned the King and the Pope to meet him within a year before the judgment seat of God, and both Pope and King were dead within 12 months. The preservation of the Templars' tradition, the destruction of the order of the Temple, did not, however, involve a complete suppression of the teaching enshrined within it. Certain of the French Knights Templars took refuge with their brethren of the Temple in Scotland, and in that country their traditions became mingled to some extent with the ancient Celtic rites of heredom, thus forming one of the sources from which the Scottish rite was later to be evolved. Traditions of vengeance upon the execrable king and pope and the traitor passed down throughout the ages, and were interwoven with the Egyptian tradition, corresponding to our black masonry, culminating in what we now call the 30 degrees. It is not difficult to see how such a confusion might arise, especially among those who did not fully understand the inner meaning of the Egyptian teaching, and how a particular and temporary idea of vengeance might be blended with the philosophical doctrine of the meaning of evil and retribution and its place in the divine plan. It is these traditions of vengeance, however little understood, that form the basis of our 30 degrees ritual. Although in modern days the tendency has been to soften the harsh outlines, as far as possible, to expunge all ideas of physical revenge, and even, as in the French rites, to delete all reference to the Templars and their wrongs. Other streams said to be from the Order of the Temple are claimed as genuine by their modern representatives, but without sufficient reason. The French Ordre du Temple alleged a direct succession from Jacques de Molay, and produced in support thereof the celebrated Charter of l'Armenneuse, which is usually considered a forgery. In any case, the Ordre du Temple had no connection with modern Masonry. The strict observance, though it claimed to perpetuate Templar lines of thought, never, I believe, held its rituals to be of ancient origin, for these clearly belong to the 18th century. The modern military and religious order of Knights Templars does not claim direct descent, though it may well embody certain genuine traditions. Its ritual is beautiful, and it appears to have been one of those rites which have been taken up by the HOATF and used. The real rites of the Templars have not survived, though it would no doubt be possible to reconstruct them, and certain traditions about them have passed down and become incorporated into various modern degrees. The Royal Order of Scotland. The most important of the bodies inheriting part of the Templar tradition is the Royal Order of Scotland, though it is in reality the result of the interaction of several lines of Masonic descent. As I have said on page 124, the doctrines which the Knights Templars brought with them from France, when their order was suppressed in their native country, were intermingled with those of more than one of the existing Scottish rites. Those who founded it, or at least developed its teaching, appear to have been thoroughly eclectic, for in addition to the two sources above indicated, they seem to have assimilated a certain amount of material from the Culdees, and also from the Jewish tradition, though using the symbology of the Second Temple. Ramsay quotes in connection with it the Jewish legend of the sword and trowel, and it is with the sword in one hand and the trowel in the other that the BRN of the Royal Order still take their oath. I have already referred to its curious old rhymed ritual, which bears internal evidence of antiquity, and teaches the search for a lost word which is eventually found in Christ. The order consists of 2 degrees, the first that of HRDM or Haredim, and the second of RSYCRS or the Rosy Cross. The degree of HRDM is divided into 2 parts, the passage of the bridge, and the admission to the cabinet of wisdom. It has certain resemblances to some of the degrees of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite. Its form has been very grossly corrupted to make it agree with the most extravagant form of modern Protestantism, with references to the blood of Jesus, to the Lamb and the Book, etc. The quest for the word is analogous to that undertaken in the Rose Croix, though the degrees are quite different. Our 18 degrees has little to do with the symbolism of the Royal Order, although the purpose of the 2 rites is the same. The 46 degrees of the Rite of Mizraim, Sovereign Prince Rose Croix of Kilwinning and of Haredim, has a close resemblance to the ritual of the Royal Order, bearing some of the signs and much of the essential meaning of all those bodies which may be thought of as developing into what afterwards became higher degrees. This Royal Order of Scotland was the first to formulate itself definitely, though little is heard of it in the outer world, and it may be taken as the primary type of the Scots degrees. The Brothers of the Rosy Cross. The mysterious Order of the Rosy Cross still remains something of a problem to the student. The glamour of the Rosicrucian philosophy has not yet passed away, and an enormous mass of controversial literature has gathered about the order, many students affirming that it never existed at all, and that its famous manifestos were but an elaborate hoax played upon Europe by a few unscrupulous jesters. Others say that the society did exist, but that it was no more than an obscure Lutheran sect which thus cleverly advertised its opinions. Others, again, think that it was a genuine school of wisdom, in which the deeper knowledge of life's secrets was given to the few who were prepared by long discipline to receive it. The literature of Rosicrucianism. The Order of the Rosy Cross was first made known to Europe by the publication in 1614 of the Fama Fraternitatis of the Meritorious Order of the Rosy Cross, addressed to the learned in general and the governors of Europe. This was, according to medieval custom, bound up with another treatise, A Universal Reformation of the Whole Wide World, by order of the god Apollo, is published by the 7 sages of Greece, and some other literati. Some have thought this latter to be a Rosicrucian pamphlet, but in reality it is a translation from the Ragwigli di Parnasso of Boccalini, and probably, as Michael Mayer held, had no connection with the order at all. 6. The Fama Fraternitatis contains a description of the traditional life of Christian Rosenkreutz, BAD 1378, the founding of the Order of the Rosy Cross, and his death and burial. This is followed by a highly symbolical account of the discovery of the tomb of C.R.C. by BRN of the Third Order and row of succession, and finally the resolution of the head of the order that it should now be proclaimed to the Western world is narrated, and an invitation issued, in 5 languages, to the learned of Europe to join the fraternity. It closes with the statement that, although at this time we make no mention either of our names or meetings, yet nevertheless, everyone's opinion shall assuredly come to our hands, in what language soever it be, nor anybody shall fail, whoso gives but his name, to speak with some of us, either by word of mouth, or else, if there be some let, in writing. 7. This extraordinary document was followed in 1615 by another striking pamphlet, the Confessio Fraternitas RC ad Eruditos Europae, which was bound up in a Latin work entitled, Secretioris Philosophiae Consideratio. Brevio A. Filippo Agabella, Philosophiae Studioso, Conscripta. In the Confessio, which is divided into 14 chapters, we have a guarded account of the aims of the society, the knowledge of nature's secrets. Contained within its different grades, the dawn of a new age of regeneration. And a consequent appeal to all those who had the welfare of mankind at heart, and who cared nothing for the folly and selfishness of the ungodly and accursed gold-making mentioned in the Fama. To join the order and partake of its privileges. We affirm that we have by no means made common property of our arcana, albeit they resound in 5 languages within the ears of the vulgar, both because, as we well know, they will not move gross wits, and because the worth of those who shall be accepted into our fraternity will not be measured by their curiosity, but by the rule and pattern of our revelations. 1,000 times the unworthy may clamour, 1,000 times may present themselves, yet God hath commanded our ears that they should hear none of them, and hath so compassed us about with his clouds that unto us, his servants, no violence can be done, wherefore now no longer are we beheld by human eyes, unless they have received strength borrowed from the eagle. 8. The Confessio is clearly written by one deeply versed in genuine occult lore, and contains a veiled but unmistakable promise that real knowledge will be given to the earnest and unselfish aspirant. A year later a third pamphlet was published at Strasbourg called The Chemical Marriage of Christian Rosenkreuz, supposed to have existed in manuscripts as early as 1601-2. It is dated anno 1459, and commences with the following significant warning. Arcana publicata vilescant, et gratium profanata omittent. Ergo, N.E. Margaritas of Gisporsis, seu asino substernir roses. 9. Showing clearly that it was meant to be taken in a mystical sense. It is a long and cryptic account, lit with gleams of humor, of the initiation of Christian Rosenkreuz into the mysteries of the Rosy Cross, commencing from his invitation, or awakening to the inner life, and ending with his final triumph or regeneration as a Knight of the Golden Stone. This is the most curious of all the Rosicrucian documents, and it will repay the close study necessary to its comprehension, for within it are contained some of the deepest secrets of spiritual alchemy. The authorship of these pamphlets has always been a matter of speculation. They have all been attributed to Johann Valentine Andreas, a cultured and traveled German scholar of the 17th century, who was much interested in secret societies, and was a follower of the doctrines of Paracelsus. The arguments for and against his authorship are very ably given by Bro A. E. Waite in his Real History of the Rosicrucians, and in his recent work, The Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, in which, however he may mistake, in our opinion, as to the real purpose and aims of the original order, the existence of which he denies, he has nevertheless brought together a mass of valuable facts which throw a good deal of light upon the whole question. Andreas acknowledges the chemical marriage, although he calls it a ludibrium, or jest. From his later works he seems to have turned against the order of the Rosy Cross, and started a new society of his own. It is extremely unlikely, however, that Andreas was the author of the Fama and the Confessio. These 3 documents raised an indescribable storm of curiosity all over Europe. Numbers of students wrote open letters applying to be admitted into the order, and setting forth their qualifications, but none of these seem to have been openly answered. A multitude of pamphlets appeared, especially in Germany, some attacking the society, and others no less valiantly defending it, while many charlatans arose, claiming to be brethren of the RC, and relieving the credulous of their superfluous money. The most noted of the opponents of Rosicrucianism was Andreas Libavius of Halle, who wrote 3 treatises against the order, in the last of which, though posing as a critic, he advises all persons to join the order, because there is much to be learned and much wisdom to be gained by so doing. 10. On the Rosicrucian side we may note the echo of the God-illuminated Brotherhood of the Venerable Order RC, published in 1615, and supposed to have been written by Julius Sperber of Anhalt, in which he asserts that the Rosicrucians possessed deep wisdom, although only a few had been accounted worthy to partake of it. The echo claimed to embody absolute proof that the statements of Fama and Confessio were possible and true, that the facts had been commonly familiar to certain God-fearing people for more than 19 years, and that they were on record in secret writings. 11. Another pamphlet published in 1617, the Fraternitatis Rosati Crucis Confessio Recepta, declares that it requires much study and careful research, as well as personal sacrifice, to become the possessor of transcendental secrets. 12. But the literature of the Rosy Cross was by no means confined to pamphlets. A system of philosophy was put before Europe through their mediation, a philosophy which bears a striking resemblance to that of the theurgic Neoplatonism of the 3rd and 4th centuries of our era. Many great names are associated with the order, among them was Michael Mayer, who died in 1622, after writing the Silentium Post Clamors 1617, the Symbola Aurea Mensi 1617, and the Themis Aurea 1618, all of which expound and defend Rosicrucian and alchemical philosophy. Thomas Vaughan, although not an actual member of the society, was in close sympathy with its tenets, and translated into English the Fama Fraternitatis and the Confessio. There were Robert Flood, a great English Rosicrucian philosopher, author of the Tractatus Apologeticus, the Tractatus Theologo-Philosophicus, and other works, Sincerus Renatus, or Sigmund Richter, who published in 1710 the curious work, The Perfect and True Preparation of the Philosophical Stone, according to the secret of the Brotherhoods of the Golden and Rosy Cross, with which is included the rules of the above-mentioned order for the initiation of new members. And, lastly, the author of the secret symbols of the Rosicrucians of the 16th and 17th centuries, a rare book containing a number of occult engravings which enshrine much inner teaching. The traditional history of the Rosicrucians. The traditional history of Christian Rosenkreuz is contained in the Fama Fraternitatis, but it obviously cannot be accepted literally as it stands. It is clearly intended to bear an allegorical and mystical meaning. Like all the traditional histories in the mystic schools, and, although certain historical facts may well be woven into its structure, they can only be subordinate to the living truth its author has sought to convey. Origen clearly states the principle always used in the mysteries in his De Principiis, where the word found that things done according to the history could be adapted to these mystical senses, he made use of them, concealing from the multitude the deeper meaning, but where, in the narrative of the development of supersensual things, there did not follow the performance of those certain events which were already indicated by the mystical meaning, the scripture interwove in the history the account of some event that did not take place, sometimes what could not have happened, sometimes what could, but did not. 13. This is one of the methods by which the secret teachings are guarded from the profane, who throw them aside, thinking that as history they are inaccurate and uninteresting, and so completely miss their deeper meaning. The Fama Fraternitatis, which admittedly contains only a tradition, written down long after the events recorded had taken place, tells us how C.R.C. was born in AD 1378, of poor but noble parents, and how he entered a monastery at a very early period of his life. While still quite young, he is said to have journeyed to Cyprus with a brother Pal, who died there. He then crossed to Palestine, and came into touch at the age of 16 with the wise men of Damcar in Arabia, who received him not as a stranger, as he himself witnesseth, but as one whom they had long expected. They called him by his name, and shewed him other secrets out of his cloister, whereat he could not but mightily wonder. 14. There he learned Arabic, translated into Latin the book M, which he afterwards brought to Europe, and in which Paracelsus was said to have been interested, and thence he travelled to Egypt and to Fez, to become acquainted with the elementary inhabitants, who revealed unto him many of their secrets. From Fez the founder of the order is said to have crossed into Spain, where he offered his knowledge to the learned, but to them it was a laughing matter. He therefore returned to Germany, his own native country, determining gradually to begin there the foundation of the brotherhood that was destined to reform Europe. He chose 3 brethren out of his own monastery to be the first Rosicrucians, and later increased the number to 8, binding them by certain definite rules. The brethren then went forth to the world, leaving only 2 of their number to remain with the head of the order. In due time, Christian Rosenkreuz died, and was buried very secretly in the tomb prepared for him, his resting place remaining unknown even to members of the fraternity. At a later period, a seeming accident revealed the door of the tomb, upon which was written in great letters, post CXX annos patepo after 120 years I will come forth. In the midst of the tomb there shone a blazing star, and upon the altar in the center of the vault these significant words were engraved, ACRC hoc universi compendium. Unius mihi sepulchrum feci, I have made this my tomb a compendium of the universe. Beneath the altar was found a fair and worthy body. With all the ornaments and attires. In his hand he held the parchment called T, the which next unto the Bible is our greatest treasure, which ought not to be delivered to the censure of the world. Various other objects were discovered, looking glasses of divers virtues, little bells, burning lamps, and chiefly wonderful artificial songs, and most important of all, the secret book M and other volumes, including certain of those of Paracelsus, the philosopher and chemist of the 16th century. Such is the traditional history of Christian Rosenkreuz, as contained in the documents of the order. The form in which the story is cast shows that it is obviously not intended to be an historical narrative. It is clearly designed as an allegory to express certain hidden truths to those whose eyes are opened, even though historical details are probably contained within it. The history of the order. Despite the assertions of scholars and the absence of corroborative evidence, Christian Rosenkreuz did indeed found the Order of the Rosy Cross, and he was in fact an incarnation of that mighty master of the wisdom whom we revere today as the HOATF. He was born in 1375, 3 years before the date given in the Fama, and was sent, when quite young, to a lonely monastery on the borders of Germany and Austria, where he received his education and training. Like many such communities in the Middle Ages, this monastery preserved a secret tradition, and its monks, who devoted themselves to meditation, were possessed of genuine spiritual and occult knowledge. Here Christian Rosenkreuz studied those deeper secrets of nature of which chemistry is but the outer shell, that alchemy, which is concerned primarily with the transformation of the lead of the personality into the gold of the spirit, and only secondarily with the transmutation of metals and the manufacture of jewels. Christian Rosenkreuz now began to travel, and after passing through Germany, Austria and Italy, finally reached Egypt, where he was welcomed by the brethren of the Egyptian Lodge, of that white brotherhood to which in past lives he had belonged. In Egypt Christian Rosenkreuz was received into all the degrees of the Egyptian mysteries, which had been preserved by the White Lodge in direct succession from the Hierophants of old, and through him we may trace one of the most important of the lines of succession which eventually became incorporated into the ancient and accepted Scottish rite. Among other things he adapted, and translated into Latin from the Egyptian, that ritual of the Rosy Cross to which we have already referred, and this became the prototype of the ceremony of perfection worked in the sovereign chapters of co-masonry today. On his return from Egypt Christian Rosenkreuz founded the Order of the Rosy Cross, choosing here and there a brother who was worthy to be brought into touch with the secret mysteries of Egypt and the profound occult knowledge which they enshrined. The order was always extremely limited in numbers, some 30 or 40 at most, but it had an enormous effect upon the secret tradition in Europe, and indeed formed a Western school through which the White Lodge might be directly reached. In later days a portion of its teaching and ritual passed into less exclusive hands, and it is through one of these semi-exoteric bodies that the Rose-Croix ritual was transmitted into the keeping of the Council of Emperors of the East and West. 15. During its passage through many hands ignorant of its true meaning, that ritual has suffered much distortion, being on the one hand blended with Protestant Christianity, as in English and American workings, or rationalized beyond recognition under the auspices of the Supreme Council of France. In our co-Masonic order we have the great privilege of using, by order of the HOATF, an English translation of his original Latin ceremonial, and I think that we may say without exaggeration that it is one of the most stately and beautiful rituals of the Rose-Croix in existence. The Rose-Croix, as we have said before, is essentially a degree of Christhood, concerned with the awakening of the Christ mystical within the heart, the hidden love which is the heart of the mystic rose, and which can only be known when the heart is laid upon the cross of sacrifice, but it was not originally intended to be an appendage to Christianity, as it has now become in England, but rather an independent sacramental channel through which the Lord of Love may pour down his blessing upon initiates of every faith, for it was founded thousands of years before the birth of the disciple Jesus in Palestine. Thus, although it is the Christ, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, who is adored in the Rose Croix, the Christ whose love is outpoured in the sovereign chapters of Haredom. In our co-Masonic ritual we speak of him only as the Lord of Love, and do not bind our BRN especially to the doctrines of the last great faith which he founded in person on earth, for he is the Lord of all religions alike, and the Rose Croix is no less his than the glorious sacraments of the Christian Church, which he himself gave 2,000 years ago. The original order of the Rosy Cross still exists in utter secrecy, and, although it is unknown in the outer world, its mysteries are yet handed down on the physical plane, and it still preserves the ancient secrets of healing and magic which its M.W.S. brought in the 15th century from the Egyptian Lodge. Only very few, and those high initiates of the White Lodge from whence it came, are admitted to its house of the Holy Spirit. Many have claimed and still claim to belong to it, but it is quite independent of the many orders and societies, both open and secret, which bear its hallowed name in the 20th century. In Masonry, however, we inherit some portion of its ritual, though but little of its hidden lore, and the sacramental powers of the Rosy Cross yet shine through certain of our high grades in the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. There is thus good reason why modern Masons have claimed affinity with the Rosy Cross, and why it has exercised so fascinating an influence over the minds of men since it was first heard of in the 17th century. It is the nearest approach to a higher degree that existed in ancient Egypt. In fact, we may say that to all intents and purposes it was a higher degree, though it never called itself so. I have explained in The Hidden Life in Freemasonry that in Egypt thousands of years ago there were 3 grand lodges which differed from all the rest in their objects and workings, and that it was these 3 lodges which, at certain stated times every year, undertook the duty of flooding the land with spiritual force by means of the magnificent ritual of the building of the Temple of Amen. 16. When the BRN were performing that holy duty, they showed their solidarity with ordinary Masonry by opening in the 1 degree and raising the lodge as quickly as possible to the 3 degrees before commencing their wonderful work. On the comparatively rare occasions when they had to admit a candidate carefully selected from one of the craft lodges, they did not open in blue masonry at all, but plunged straight into the ceremony of the Rose Croix. The ritual had to be modified somewhat in the 18th century to bring it into harmony with the system of higher degrees which it had then been thought well to adopt. The list and explanation of those degrees were added, and also the reference to Jerusalem. The word, which in modern Masonry has degenerated into mere initials, was then in itself a living word of power, pregnant with deepest meaning, though a double scheme of initials was also used. All this needed and received the most skillful attention when the translation from Egyptian into Latin was made. One cannot but admire the marvelous ingenuity which, while changing the language, yet contrived to keep practically intact the sound, the form, and an elaborate triple set of meanings, one within the other. The 18th century editions have considerably lengthened the ceremony, but they are congruous with the older part, so that it still retains its transcendent beauty. And all the principal features of the degree, the rose, the cross, the cup, the sacrament, are precisely the same as they were thousands of years ago. 1 Op. Cit. Pages 27-9. 2 Ibid. p. 124. 3 The Reception of a Templar. Bro. E. J. Castle, K.C. in AQC, Volume 15, p. 163. 4 Quelques Reflex Ion sur les origines de la Franc-Maçonnerie Templière, Parle Grand Commander du Suprême Conseil de Belgique, Count Goblet d'Alviela. Bruxelles, 1904, p. 8. 5 See also Encyclopaedia Britannica. Art. Templars. From which much of the above information is derived. 6 A. E. Waite. The Real History of the Rosicrucians, p. 35. 7 Fama Fraternitatis, quoted OPCIT, p. 83. 8 Confessio Fraternitatis, quoted OPCIT, p. 90. 9 Published secrets become valueless, and things profaned lose their grace. Therefore cast not pearls before swine, nor strew roses before an ass. OPCIT, p. 99. 10 The Real History of the Rosicrucians, p. 252. 11. The Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, p. 254. 12 The Real History of the Rosicrucians, p. 256. 13 Origen, BK4, Chap. I. 15, Ante-Nicene Library ed. 14 Fama Fraternitatis. Quoted in the Real History, etc. p. 67, from which translation the citations following are also taken. 15. See Chapter 11. 16. The Hidden Life in Freemasonry, p. 290. 11. The Scottish Rite. Origin of the Rite. The origin of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of 33 degrees, or rather that of the Rite of Perfection or of Heredom of 25 degrees out of which it was evolved, has been one of the most obscure Masonic problems. Practically nothing is known about it by scholars, since no authentic contemporary evidence is preserved in available documents or publications. This silence need cause but little wonder to the student who has followed us so far, for, like many other activities both in politics and religion, the high-grade Masonry of the early 18th century was intended to be kept secret, and the secrecy was preserved by committing nothing to writing and leaving no trace on the physical plane. I cannot expect that my statements will be accepted by Masonic scholars who pin their faith to documents alone, but I shall nevertheless give a brief account of what actually took place, supplying corroborative evidence whenever possible from reliable historians, so far as their works are available to me. This book is written in Australia, far away from the chief centers of Masonic life and learning, and I have consequently had to depend largely upon the resources of my own library. If I had access to a larger selection of Masonic volumes, I should no doubt be able to find other fragments of valuable testimony. Plate 9. Signs in Egypt. Plate X. Plate 11. The Veils. Bro Annie Besant, 33 degrees. Plate 12. Pioneer Co-Masons of England. The Jacobite movement. There has been a persistent tradition among continental writers upon Masonry that the Jacobites had much to do with the development of the higher degrees of the 18th century, and, as Bro R. F. Gould points out, color is lent to this view by the fact that the earliest names mentioned in connection with Freemasonry in France are those of well-known adherents of the Stuarts, although he himself rejects the hypothesis for lack of sufficient evidence. Point 1. We have the direct and personal testimony of Baron von Hunt, the founder of the Rite of the Strict Observance, given in 1764. That he himself was received into the Order of the Temple in Paris in 1743 by an unknown Bro, the Knight of the Red Feather, in the presence of Lord Kilmarnock II, and that he was subsequently introduced as a distinguished brother of the order to Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender. Point 3. From papers found after his death it is clear that von Hunt regarded the Knight of the Red Feather as Prince Charles himself. The life of von Hunt shows him to have been a man of stainless honor who had made great sacrifices for the cause which he had at heart, and although it has been said that in 1777 Prince Charles denied to an emissary of the strict observance for that he had ever been a Freemason, such an official dementi is not unknown even today in political circles, and perhaps we need not attach great importance to it. The Scottish adherents of King James II, who followed him into exile after the landing of the Prince of Orange in 1688, brought to the English court at St. Germain's, which had been placed at the disposal of the king by Louis XIV, those ancient rites of Heredom and Kilwinning, intermingled with the Templar tradition, to which we have already referred. When King James II fled from England, he took refuge at the Jesuit Abbey of Clermont, which had attached to it a college of Clermont in Paris, founded by Guillaume du Prat, Bishop of Clermont, in 1550.5. There, most unexpectedly, the king found a Masonic center, working rites which had been handed down in France from a remote past. An intermingling of two traditions thus took place, and it was at this period, many years before the revival in 1717, that certain of the ceremonies which are today included in the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite were first put together. It is probably this fact which gave birth to that other recurring tradition, that the Jesuits were connected with the development of high-grade Masonry on the continent, and it is from this indigenous French tradition, of which another branch had found its way into the Compagnonnage, that the rituals of French craft Masonry, so different from the English, were derived. A further intermingling with the English tradition transmitted through Anderson no doubt took place after 1717. King James conceived the idea of trying to use Freemasonry to assist him in his endeavor to regain his throne, but this attempt failed, for though they sympathized with the king, the Masonic authorities staunchly refused to abandon their traditional neutral policy, or to allow the order to become a cloak for political intrigue. The Jacobite influence nevertheless left its traces upon this part of Masonry, and in the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite the 14 degrees is still called, under some obediences, Grand Scottish Knight of the Sacred Vault of James VI, though its older name was Grand Elect, Ancient Perfect Master. 6. Baron von Hunt spoke the truth when he claimed to have met Prince Charles in Paris in 1743, and he seems to have inherited certain lines of succession which afterwards became the heart of the rite of the strict observance. After the Battle of Culloden in 1746, which practically destroyed the Jacobite movement, the connection of the Stuarts with Masonry was dropped, and it seems probable that Baron von Hunt himself composed the Latin rituals of the strict observance, which played a considerable part in German Masonry in the 18th century. 7. The Oration of Ramsay. After the year 1740, Scots degrees sprang up in all parts of France, and their creation and development are largely attributable to the celebrated oration delivered in 1737 in the Provincial Grand Lodge of England in Paris by the Chevalier Ramsay, although the first published reference to a Scotch Mason's Lodge occurs as early as 1733 in London. 9. Ramsay was born in 1681 or 1682 at Ayr near Kilwinning, though he does not seem ever to have joined that ancient lodge. He was converted to Catholicism by Archbishop Fenelon, whose life he wrote and with whom he continued to live till his death in 1715. After that he acted as tutor to the two sons of the rightful King James III in Rome. He was unquestionably a learned man, a deep student both of ancient and modern history, a DCL of Oxford University and, like many other prominent Freemasons of the period, a Fellow of the Royal Society. He never appears to have taken much interest in Masonry, though he wrote to Cardinal Fleury, the Prime Minister of France, in 1737 asking his protection for the Freemasons, and stating that their ideals were very high and most useful to religion, literature, and the state. He died in 1743. But although Ramsay never did much work for Masonry, the oration, which he delivered in 1737 before the Provincial Grand Lodge of England in Paris, of which he was Grand Chancellor and orator, had a profound influence upon French Masonry. It was a tolerably good oration, but nothing very extraordinary. Nonetheless, it appears to have given just that impetus that was needed to set the French high-grade movement in activity. And ever afterwards the makers of high grades looked to Ramsay as their pattern and ensample. He proclaimed the ideal of Masonry to be a universal brotherhood of cultured men, a spiritual empire that would change the world. He refers to the 3 degrees, and calls them novices or apprentices, fellows or professed brothers, masters or perfected brothers, a slightly different set of titles which may refer to a different stream of tradition. These are required to practice respectively the moral virtues, the heroic virtues and the Christian virtues. According to him, Masonry was founded in remote antiquity and was renewed or restored in the Holy Land at the time of the Crusades. It has affinities with the ancient mysteries, especially those of Ceres at Eleusis, Isis in Egypt and others. The Crusaders adopted a set of ancient signs and symbolical words drawn from the well of religion, which were intended to distinguish Crusader from Saracen, and were concealed under strict pledges of secrecy. The intimate union between the crusading Masons and the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem is the reason why the blue degrees are called St. John's Masonry. The returning Crusaders brought lodges of Masonry to Europe, and from thence they were introduced into Scotland, where James, Lord Steward of Scotland, was Grand Master of a lodge established at Kilwinning, in the west of Scotland in 1286, shortly after the death of Alexander III, King of Scotland, and 1 year before John Balliol mounted the throne. Ramsay goes on to explain that by degrees our lodges and rites were neglected almost everywhere, but nevertheless they were preserved in all their integrity amongst those Scotsmen to whom the kings of France confided during many centuries the safeguarding of their royal persons. He allows that Great Britain became the seat of our order, the conservator of our laws and the depository of our secrets. Many of our rites and usages, which were contrary to the prejudice of the reformers, were changed, disguised or suppressed. Thus it was that many BRN forgot the spirit and retained only the shell of the outer form. Masonry, however, is to be restored to its pristine glory in the future. The rituals of these Scots degrees are varied, but one chief idea underlies them all: the discovery in a vault by Scottish crusaders of the long-lost and ineffable word, during the search for which they had to work with the sword in one hand, and the trowel in other. 10. This same symbolism of the sword and the trowel is mentioned in Ramsay's speech, in which he derives Freemasonry from the patriarchs and the ancient mysteries through the Scottish crusaders, and they are further mentioned both in the present ritual of the Royal Order of Scotland, in which the candidate takes his oath with a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other. 11. And in a quotation from that ritual occurring as early as 1736 in print at Newcastle. 12. We hear of 2 Scottish degrees being received by Baron C. Scheffer, the first Grand Master of Sweden, in 1737,13. And we may perhaps suggest, though in opposition to the theory held by most Masonic writers, that the oration of Ramsay, although it may have helped to popularize Scottish Masonry, was in reality an effect rather than the cause of the introduction of high-grade Masonry on the continent, which was all the time being quietly directed from behind by the HOATF. The Scots masters claimed extraordinary privileges in the French craft lodges, and these were formally recognized by the Grand Lodge of France. In 1755.14, they wore distinctive clothing, remained covered in a master's lodge, claimed the right to confer the craft degrees with or without a ceremony, and eventually the Scots Lodge actually appointed the WM of the corresponding craft lodge without consulting the BRN over whom he was to rule. They further usurped the privilege of the Grand Lodge and issued warrants of constitution. One of the most important of these is the Mere Loge Assize of Marseilles, said to have been constituted in 1751, which worked a number of degrees not belonging to what afterwards became the Scottish Rite, but later incorporated at least as far as their titles are concerned in the Rite of Memphis of 96 degrees. These Scots lodges, or still more, the Royal Order of Scotland from which they arose, form the first public manifestation of the movement for creating high degrees, which reached such a fervour of activity in the latter half of the 18th century. The chapter of Clermont. Our main channel of descent lies behind the Scots lodges, and first appears indubitably in the outer world in the chapter of Clermont, commonly thought to have been founded by the Chevalier de Bonneville in 1754-15, but in reality a continuation of that same order of the Temple into which Baron von Hund was received in 1743, which was derived from the Scottish courtiers exiled at St. and from the College of Clermont. According to Thory, who, however, wrote 60 years after the event, this chapter was based on the 3 degrees of Blue Masonry, the Scots, or S. Andrew's degree, and worked 3 higher grades: 5, Knight of the Eagle, or Select Master; 6, Illustrious Knight or Templar; 7, Sublime Illustrious Knight. In the later form, in which it emerges in 1754, both Jacobite and Jesuit connections had been dropped, and the succession, together with certain ceremonial degrees, probably including a form of the Kadosh, had passed into the hands of distinguished French noblemen, courtiers, military officers, and the elite of the profession. 16. It was in this chapter of Clermont, and in the Council of the Emperors of the East and West, into which it was transformed in 1758, that the colossal work of casting the ancient traditions into a ceremonial rite was to a great extent performed, and it is in these 2 bodies, which were yet one body, that the immediate origin of our ancient and accepted Scottish rite is to be found. The Council of Emperors. The Council of Emperors was composed largely of men of noble birth and high culture, who were also deep students of the secret science, learned in various traditions of the wisdom which had been handed down along so many lines in the past. They had inherited not only the Clermont rites and the Scottish lines of Kilwinning and of Haredom, but other traditions derived directly from both Templar and Rosicrucian sources, together with the powers of the Egyptian rite to which we have previously referred. They were men of wide knowledge, but also apparently of overweening pride, like so many of the nobles of the Ancien regime. And the drawing together of this body of noblemen was one of the attempts made by the emissaries of the White Lodge to prepare them for the great changes which should have been accomplished, had not their pride been so great, without the horrors of the French Revolution. A definite commission appears to have been given to them by the Eta Omicron ATF, the master the Comte de Saint-Germain himself, to mold all these various traditions, which he had caused them to inherit, into a rite which should express to some extent the power for good of the Egyptian succession in a form suited to a more modern age. These orders they proceeded to carry out as faithfully as possible, and the result of their labors was the rite of perfection or of heredom of 25 degrees, all of which are still contained in our modern ancient and accepted Scottish rite. The Council of Emperors received much inspiration from the HOATF, although not necessarily on the physical plane, and it must have been far easier to influence such a body of men than the frequenters of those Georgian taverns which were the first temples of the English mysteries, after the Great Revival in 1717. But, as with many other attempts to synthesize a number of traditions by a committee of revision, the Council of Emperors was hampered in its work by the necessity of including less important materials which had come into the hands of certain of its members. The result is seen in the inclusion of several almost meaningless intermediate degrees, which still belong to the Scottish Rite, but are seldom or never worked among us. A certain marriage of traditions took place in the case of the 18 degrees, for the great ritual of the Rosy Cross used for the perfecting of the Rosicrucian and Egyptian brethren, though shorn already of much of its ancient splendor, was blended with the old Mithraic Eucharist handed down in the rites of heredom, to form the source of our modern workings of the Rose-Croix. The Emperor's ritual of the 30 degrees, then called the 24 degrees, Grand Commander of the Black and White Eagle, Grand Elect Kadosh, reflected far more efficiently the Egyptian teachings of Black Masonry than those which have today reached us through the hands of many editors, who were ignorant of their true meaning. The highest degree among them was the 25 degrees, now are 32 degrees, called Most Illustrious Prince of Masonry, Grand and Sublime Knight, Commander of the Royal Secret, and the tracing board of the 32 degrees, often little understood, reflects their original plan of union with the hidden light. Through the passing of many rites of initiation, there was no degree of sovereign Grand Inspector General, for the 33 degrees as such did not yet exist, but the wonderful powers which now belong to that high rank were conferred upon their Grand Inspectors, chosen from among the Prince Masons of the 25 degrees, and the great white angels who wear the insignia of the king were linked with these, even as they are linked with the BRN of the 33 degrees today. The crimson angels of the Rosy Cross likewise attended their sovereign chapters, and many other glorious powers which are ours today were theirs also. Thus the Council of Emperors represents the first real attempt ever made to incorporate the full Egyptian inner tradition into a ceremonial form, and as such it is an important landmark in the history of Masonry. Almost all the splendid teaching given by the great master the Comte Saint Germain, by Père Joseph and Cagliostro, and other emissaries of the White Lodge, was swept into oblivion in the colossal tragedy of the French Revolution. The rite of perfection of 25 degrees was carried into Great Britain, and handed down among the Templar encampments long before the advent of the Supreme Councils of the Scottish Rite which derived their authority from Charleston. Most of the BRN of the old Rite joined the new obediences as soon as they were formed, but there exists today one line of tradition at least, in part derived from those old Templar encampments, which has never been incorporated in the Supreme Councils of England, Scotland, and Ireland. There was also a perpetuation in France, which later amalgamated with the French Supreme Council. 17. Stephen Morin. The scene of our story now shifts to the New World, for it was there that the change from the rite of perfection of 25 degrees into the Scottish rite of 33 degrees took place. In 1761, 3 years only after its foundation, the Council of the Emperors of the East and West granted a patent to one Stephen Morin to establish perfect and sublime masonry in all parts of the world, constituting him a Grand Inspector of the Rite of Perfection. The patent authorized him to form and establish a lodge in order to admit to and multiply the Royal Order of Masons in all the perfect and sublime degrees, and gave him power to create other inspectors. The original of this document has not yet been found, and the world knows of it only from the copy preserved in the Golden Book of the Comte de Gros-Tilly, founder of the Supreme Council 33 degrees of France. Bro R. F. Gould, however, has a right intuition in the matter, for he is by no means prepared to deny its authenticity, and a complete transcription of it is given in his History of Freemasonry. 18. It is signed by Caroline de Joinville, Prince de Rohan, Brest de la Chaussée, Comte de Choiseul, and others of the Council of the Emperors. In 1761, Stephen Morin arrived in San Domingo, where he commenced the dissemination of the rite, and appointed many inspectors, both for the West Indies and the United States. 19. he was unfortunately by no means an ideal channel for spiritual force. And although he certainly transmitted to his American BR and the Egyptian succession of powers, he was sometimes not in possession of the fullness of the power himself. At times he rose splendidly to the occasion, and showed signs of distinct advancement. I have watched him during the consecration of a chapter of the high degrees magnificently overshadowed by the HOATF himself and the great white angels. But it cannot be denied that he had many faults, among others a passion for amorous intrigues, and not infrequently the greater part of his spiritual heritage was withdrawn, leaving him the mere seeds of the succession to transmit to others. The reports of his misdoings were so numerous and persistent that at one time the Council of Emperors actually withdrew his patent, but posts were slow in those days, and before the withdrawal reached him the Council had already cancelled it, and fully reinstated him. Stephen Moran was also unfortunate in his choice of lieutenants, for in many cases these were Jews of not very good repute, and it is through these somewhat soiled hands that we must trace the rite of perfection during the next 40 years. The rite passed through a period of obscuration, when the degrees were shamelessly sold to any who would buy their titles, and the inner meaning of the ceremonies was almost forgotten. But although the splendid occult knowledge of the emperors was lost and the rites became shorn of most of their power, the seeds of the succession still passed down until a higher class of egos was guided into the rite and a new era began. The rite was established at Charleston in 1783 by Isaac da Costa, who was created Deputy Inspector of South Carolina by Moses Hayes. It will be seen that a succession is definitely claimed by the authorities of the rite. Frederick the Great. It was during this period of obscuration that the curious myth of Frederick the Great arose among the Jews, probably in order to enhance the commercial value of the degrees, and it was apparently really believed that the King of Prussia was the supreme head of the rite, for in the minutes of the Grand Lodge of Perfection in Albany, New York, founded in 1767, the lodge is required, on September 3, 1770, to prepare its report for transmission to Berlin. We find also in 1785, 1 year before the king's death, a letter addressed to Frederick by a certain Solomon Bush, Deputy Grand Inspector of North America, asking for recognition of a lodge which he had consecrated. 20. It was afterwards alleged that Frederick the Great, on his deathbed, ratified the Grand Constitutions of 1786 containing the laws that still bind the Scottish Rite, and that he constituted the 33 degrees in person, delegating his powers as a sovereign of Masonry to 9 BRN in each country. The original Grand Constitutions were in French, but in 1834 a Latin version of them alleged to have been signed by Frederick himself was accepted as genuine by the Supreme Council of France, but this is now on all sides admitted to be a forgery. The truth is that Frederick took no active part in the rite of perfection, that he neither ratified the constitutions nor created the 33 degrees, and indeed today the majority even of the Supreme Councils are prepared to waive the claim that they derive their authority from Frederick the Great, whose interest in Masonry, at any rate in later years, was but of the slightest. The Grand Constitutions nevertheless remain the law of the right in all Supreme Councils deriving lawfully from Charleston, and Albert Pike believed them to be genuine, as it is certain that Frederick had nothing to do with the rite. I fear we must regretfully conclude that both the fourth and the fifth documents in de Grostilly's Golden Book, the alleged constitutions of 1762, and the Grand Constitutions of 1786 were forgeries. It would seem that they were sent over from Europe, perhaps in response to a demand from the Jewish interest, and the fact that Dr. Dalcho's father was an officer in the Prussian army who had served with great distinction under Frederick the Great may well have disposed the doctor the more readily to accept these remarkable documents. The Charleston Transformation. The second great transformation of the high degrees, though it was on a far smaller scale than the first, took place at Charleston before 1801. We learn from the circular of Dr. Dalcho that on the 31st of May, 1801, the Supreme Council of the 33rd degree for the United States of America was opened, with the high honors of Masonry, by brothers John Mitchell and Frederick Dalcho, Sovereign Grand Inspectors General, and in the course of the present year, 1802, the whole Number of Grand Inspectors General was completed, agreeably to the Grand Constitution's point 21. Such is a brief account of the formation of that which called itself the Mother Supreme Council of the World, from which, indeed, all other Supreme Councils of the world spring, with the exception of a few survivals of other lines of descent. It is clear from archives in the possession of the Mother Supreme Council that up to the eve of its formation the only degrees worked were the 25 degrees of the Rite of Perfection. The formation of the new rite was inspired and directed by the HOATF himself, and the extra 8 degrees which then appeared were but rearrangements of the old 25 degrees of the Rite of Perfection. Now that more advanced egos had come into possession of the degrees, a fuller manifestation of the power behind was permitted, and since then the Scottish Rite, though its rituals have been altered in various countries and in various interests, has become the most important and splendid of all Masonic obediences. The spread of the Scottish Rite. We may here refer back to the third document in the Golden Book. The patent granted to de Grosse-Tilly by the new Supreme Council 33 degrees in Charleston in 1802, only a few months after its formation, which certifies that he has been tested in all the degrees of the rite and authorizes him to erect lodges, chapters, councils and consistories in both hemispheres, creating him sovereign Grand Commander of a Supreme Council for the Antilles for life. It is signed by Dalcho, de la Hogue and others, who all describe themselves as Kadosh, Prince of the Royal Secret, SOV. Gr. Inspector 33 degrees. The Scottish Rite was introduced by the Comte de Grosse-Tilly into France, 1804, from France it passed into Italy, 1805, Spain, 1811, and Belgium, 1817. In 1824 the Supreme Council for Ireland was formed with jurisdiction over the official degrees of White Masonry only, because of the previous existence of chapters and lodges of Rose-Croix and Kadosh, belonging to the old Rite of Perfection. The Supreme Council of England and Wales was formed in 1845, and that of Scotland a year later. In America in 1812 a working jeweler named Joseph Cerno established in Boston what he called a sovereign Grand Consistory of the United States. Cerno possessed the necessary succession, and so was able to pass on the actual powers, but as he had no mandate from the Council of Emperors the Charleston Supreme Council denounced his proceedings as irregular, and themselves appointed a Supreme Council for the Northern jurisdiction a year later. Supreme Councils deriving from Cerno still exist, though they are not recognized by bodies holding the Charleston succession. Both lines, however, are valid. The rite has spread into almost all countries of the world, and does an incalculable amount of good to thousands upon thousands of BRN, even though but few derive from it the full possibilities of spiritual advancement which lie behind it. But to be brought, however unconsciously, into touch with so holy an influence must unquestionably uplift and bless even the least sensitive, and some touch of its hidden glory is conferred upon all. 1 Gould History Freem, 3, 78. 2 At that time Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and Master of Lodge Kilwinning on his election to that high office in 1742. Ibid, p. 53. 3 Ibid, p. 101. 4 Ibid, p. 110. 5 The Catholic Encyclopedia, 1913, Volume 14, p. 88. 6 A. E. Waite. Secret Tradition in Freemasonry, Volume I, p. 125. 7 Gould History Freem, 3, 101. 8 Ibid, p. 92. 9 R. F. Gould, AQC, 16, 44. 10 Hist Freem, 3, p. 92. 11 A. E. Waite. Secret Tradition in Freemasonry, Volume I, p. 404. 12 A.Q.C, 15, 186. 13 Gould Concise History, p. 300. 14 Gould History Freem, 3, p. 95. 15 Ibid, p. 94. 16 Ibid, p. 95. 17 Gould History Freem, p. 164. 18 3, p. 125 ff. 19 Mackey S. Encyclopedia. Art. Scottish Rite. 20 Note Historique sur le Rite Écosse, ANC, ETACC, PARLE Suv, GR, Count Goblet d'Alviela, p. 7. 21 Quoted in Mackey's Encyclopedia. Art. Supreme Council. 12. The Comasonic Order. The restoration of an ancient landmark. The co-Masonic order is distinguished from the rest of the Masonic world by the admission of women to Masonry on equal terms with men. In this it is introducing no innovation into the body of Masonry, but rather restoring one of the ancient landmarks which was forgotten during the confusion of the mysteries with the operative Masonry of the Middle Ages. In both Egypt and Greece, as we have seen, women were admitted to the mysteries and were able to penetrate into the inmost sanctuaries as well as men. The officials of the masculine craft are for the most part against their admission. Today, they have been most strongly impressed, and quite rightly so, with the paramount importance of keeping the rituals and customs unchanged. But they quite wrongly regard the admission of women as a serious departure from ancient usage. Co-Masons are equally urgent in their respect for the traditions, but in this matter they prefer to follow the older custom, which has also the added merit of being logical and fair. Since reincarnation is a fact, there is no difference between the ego or soul of a man and that of a woman, and we do not see any reason why in a particular birth, because he happens in the course of his evolution to occupy a woman's body, that ego should be deprived of the advantages of initiation into the sacred mysteries of Masonry. The succession of co-Masonry. The co-Masonic order derives its succession of sovereign grand inspectors general of the 33 degrees from certain BRN belonging to the Supreme Council of France, founded by the Comte de Grostilly in 1804. In his booklet, Universal Co-Freemasonry, what is it? The very illustrious Broje I. Wedgwood, 33 degrees gives the following account of its foundation, which he derives from the official minutes of the Supreme Council published in Dr. Georges Martin's Étude de la Franc-Maçonnerie Mixte et de son Organization, and from Transaction No. I of the Dharma Lodge, Benares. Our own order of Universal Co-Freemasonry, or, to give it its French title, L'Ordre Maçonnique Mixte International, is the first Masonic body which has aimed at establishing a worldwide order to which women should be admitted on equal terms with men. Its career began in the year 1882. There existed a body styling itself Grande Loge Symbolique Écossaise de France. It consisted of various craft lodges which had broken loose from the Supreme Council in France and constituted themselves into a Grand Lodge. It was only anticipating what the other craft lodges under the Supreme Council did in 1894-97, when they organized themselves into the now existing Grand Lodge of France, and absorbed into themselves, with one exception, the lodges of La Grande Loge Symbolique Écossaise de France. This latter body, with which we are concerned, almost at once received recognition from the Grand Orient of France. The principle which this particular schism espoused was that of the autonomy of craft lodges, summed up in the phrase "Le Macon libre dans la loge libre." Principle sound enough in the main, but, it may at once be confessed, obviously not capable of application outside certain wide limits. Still, it has always received much recognition in France, ever since French Masonry broke away from the parent English stem. One of the lodges holding from this body was called Les Libres Penseurs, and met at Pec, a little place in the department of Seine-et-Oise. This lodge belonging to a then recognized Masonic obedience decided to initiate a woman, a certain Mdlle. Maria de Raismes, a well-known authoress and lecturer, noted for her service to humanitarian and feminist movements. They did so, in the presence of a large assembly, on January 14, 1882. The Right Worshipful Master, Bro Houbrun, 18 degrees, justified their experiment as having the welfare and highest interests of humanity at heart, and as being a perfectly logical application of the principle of a Freemason in a free lodge. The lodge was of course suspended for putting the family motto into practice. For some time Sister Maria de Raismes did nothing in the way of extending to others the Masonic privileges she had received. Eventually she yielded to the persuasions of friends, and notably of Dr. Georges Martin. This latter gentleman was a member of the Lodge Les Libres Penseurs. When Mdlle. de Raismes was initiated, he gave her his staunch support and the benefit of his wide Masonic experience throughout her Masonic career. Upon his retirement from political life he had been a senator. He devoted his energies to the helping of humanity through our order. On March 14, 1893, Sister de Raismes initiated a number of ladies, in the presence of Dr. Martin, and on April 4 of the same year La Grande Loge Symbolique Écossaise de France, Le Droit Humain, came into being. In 1900 the new Grand Lodge, with a view to extending its ramifications into other countries, found it desirable to work the higher degrees. Aided, therefore, by brethren in possession of the 33 degrees. The body was raised from a craft Grand Lodge to a Supreme Council of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. Madame Marie Martin, the close friend and collaborator of MDLLE d'Erasmus, succeeded upon the death of the latter to the leadership of the movement, Dr. Georges Martin holding the office of Grand Orator, and she occupied her exalted position with distinction, with dignity, and with utter devotion, until her demise in 1914. There are lodges in France, Belgium, England, Scotland, India, Australia, South Africa, America. Over 100, Holland, Java, Switzerland, and Norway. We need add only a few words about the movement in England. The first of our English lady members to enter the order was our highly esteemed sister Francicia Arundel, Mrs. Annie Besant. Feeling that a Masonic movement open to men and women alike could be made a powerful force for good in the world, who had been offered initiation by MDLLE d'Erasmus, learned of the continuance of the order from Miss Arundel, and sought initiation in Paris. She was subsequently created Vice President Grand Master of the Supreme Council and Deputy for Great Britain and its dependencies. The first co-Masonic lodge was consecrated in London in September, 1902, by the Grand Officers of the Supreme Council, under the title of Human Duty, No. 6.1, see plates X and 11, following p. 178. With the advent of Dr. Annie Besant to the leadership of the order in the British Empire, the direct link between Masonry and the Great White Lodge, which has ever stood behind it, though all unknown to the majority of the BRN, was once again reopened, and the HOATF has taken a keen personal interest in its development. The ancient English and Scottish succession of installed masters, installed Mark Masters and installed First Principles of the Holy Royal Arch of Jerusalem was introduced into co-Masonry by sympathetic BRN from the masculine obediences, and these degrees now form part of our British co-Masonic workings. Plate 12. Following p. 178. The co-Masonic rituals. In 1916, by order of the HOATF, the ritual of the craft degrees was finally revised in accordance with their ancient occult meaning, this ritual being based upon the English and Scottish workings. Certain features, such as the recognition of the elementals and the three symbolical journeys, were introduced from the French craft rituals worked under the auspices of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite with further modifications from occult sources. This ritual was approved by the HOATF himself, who deigned to work it in his own lodge, afterwards making certain suggestions, which were of course immediately adopted. In 1923 he further most graciously authorized an English translation of his Latin ritual of the Rose Croix, to be worked in those sovereign chapters RC who desired to make use of it. The celebration of this ceremonial has enormously quickened the occult strength of our chapters. And though as yet we cannot hope to equal the old Egyptian working, we are able to some extent to call down and pour forth upon the world the splendid powers of the Rosy Cross. In 1925 the HOATF was kind enough to allow the use of a mark ritual which had been brought into line with the inner meaning of the degree, and in the same year he directed that a ritual of the Holy Royal Arch should be prepared, embodying certain suggestions which he himself had deigned to make. Thus step by step the whole working is being revised in accordance with the ancient knowledge, and the way to the restoration of the mysteries is being prepared. The future of Masonry. Masonry must surely have a wonderful part to play in the civilization of the future. Not for naught have the old hallowed rites been preserved in secret and the immemorial powers of the mysteries transmitted throughout the ages to our modern world of the 20th century, for we stand today on the threshold of a new era, which will be heralded by the coming forth once more of the world teacher, the Lord of Love himself, who taught in Palestine 2,000 years ago. We have seen that human evolution takes place according to a cyclic law, race succeeds race, and subrace follows subrace according to the plan of the great architect of the universe, working in this world through that white lodge which is the guardian of humanity. The time has come for the blossoming of a new subrace, the sixth of our great Aryan race, and it is already beginning to appear in North America, Australia, and other lands. In that subrace, as in all the others, there will be egos of different temperaments. Some no doubt will seek their inspiration in the liberal forms of Catholic Christianity, but others will find themselves attracted to the philosophic and ceremonial teaching formerly given in the mysteries of Egypt, which are the heritage of the Masonic Brotherhood. The coming of the world teacher has always in the past marked a revival or an inauguration of the mysteries. Thoth in Egypt, Zoroaster in Persia, Orpheus in Greece. Each of these mighty messengers of the White Lodge, who were yet one messenger appearing under different names and in different forms, left behind him a glorious rite of initiation to lead men to his feet after he had gone. That great teacher of mankind passed from human sight as Gautama the Lord Buddha, but the scepter of the Lord of Love was placed by the spiritual king in the hands of his successor, whom today we revere as the Lord Christ, whose coming we await with hearts filled with longing love. He, too, will surely take the sacred vessels of the mysteries and fill them anew with his own wonderful life. He, too, will mold them according to the needs of his people and the age in which they live. For the influence of the sixth ray, the ray of devotion which inspired the Christian mystics and the glorious Gothic architecture of the Middle Ages is passing away, and the seventh ray is beginning to dominate the world, the ray of ceremonial magic which brings the especial cooperation of the angelic hosts, of which Masonry itself with its many-colored pageant of rites is a splendid manifestation. Thus in the coming days, when the Lord of Love, who is our most wise sovereign and the Prince of sovereign princes, will visit yet again his holy sanctuaries guarded throughout the ages by his great disciple, the Prince Adept of the seventh ray and the master of our craft, we may look for a restoration to the worthy, and to the worthy alone, not only of the full splendor of ceremonial initiation, once more to be a true vehicle of the hidden light, but also of that secret wisdom of the mysteries, which has long been forgotten in the outer lodges and chapters of the Brotherhood. Such surely is the destiny that awaits our beloved order in the future. Such the splendor that will transfigure the craft in the years that are to come, until within its temple walls once more is raised not only in symbol, but in actual fact the ladder which stretches between earth and heaven, between men and the grand lodge above, to lead them from the darkness of the world to the fullness of light in God, to the rose which ever blossoms at the heart of the cross, to the blazing star whose shining brings peace and strength and blessing to all the worlds. Transmutamini de lapidibus mortuus in lapides vivos philosophicos. S.M.I.B. Appendix I. The degrees of the rite of perfection, compared with those of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite. Appendix I. List of 25 degrees. Worked by the Council of Emperors of the East and West. 1758. Warning, empty page. The BRN of the highest degree were termed the Council of the Emperors of the East and West, Sovereign Prince Masons, Substitutes General of the Royal Art, Grand Surveillance, and Officers of the Grand Sovereign Lodge of S. John of Jerusalem, and the rite which they worked was called the Rite of Perfection or of Haredum. There was also an office or rank of Grand Inspector, though there was no degree of Sovereign Grand Inspector General until the beginning of the 19th century. On the formation of the Mother Supreme Council at Charleston in 1801. 8 further degrees were added to the 25 degrees to make the total of 33 degrees. It is supposed that these were drawn from continental sources. Most of them were previously worked under a grand chapter of Prince Masons in Ireland. They received the approval of the HOATF. These are 23 degrees Chief of the Tabernacle, 24 degrees Prince of the Tabernacle, 25 degrees Knight of the Brazen Serpent, 26 degrees Prince of Mercy, 27 degrees Sovereign Commander of the Temple, 29 degrees Grand Scottish Knight of St. Andrew, 31 degrees Grand Inquisitor Commander, 33 degrees Sovereign Grand Inspector General. Appendix 2. Table of Principal Masonic Events from 1717. Note. The history of Freemasonry, and more especially of its higher degrees and what are called the side degrees, during the 18th and 19th centuries is so extraordinarily confused and questionable that I think it is advisable to arrange its principal events in chronological order, in tabular form, and in parallel columns, tracing its development in England, on the continent of Europe, and in North America respectively. The organization, whose story we are trying to follow, is after all a secret organization. It moves steadily on its way in the privacy of its lodge rooms, and it is only rarely and as it were by accident that any reference to it or to its proceedings appears in the light of day. Little wonder that accounts are scrappy, and difficult to reconcile one with another. We are dealing with sporadic and largely accidental manifestations, and no outer indication has before been given, so far as I know, to the inner clue which makes all the confusion clear. That clue is of course the existence of the HOATF, who is acting all the time for Masonry, the part popularly assigned to Providence watching over it, guiding its activities in this direction or that, stimulating it where it needs stimulation, bringing it to the surface in one place, and letting it sink out of sight in another, and seeing that, in one way or another, its existence is maintained and its light ever kept burning. He is the true hidden life in Freemasonry, to whom my previous volume referred. It is his energy flowing through it which has kept this wonderful body alive, while he continues to inspire it. We need have no fear for its future. Table of Principal Masonic Events from 1717. Warning, empty page. 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 Quest books are published by the Theosophical Society in America. Wheaton, Illinois 60189-0270. A branch of a world organization dedicated to the promotion of the unity of humanity and the encouragement of the study of religion, philosophy, and science, to the end that we may better understand ourselves and our place in the universe. The Society stands for complete freedom of individual search and belief. This has been a production by the Mental Chemist for Study and Education. Copyright 2024.